Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. My name's Gary Wensky, and I'm Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, and I hope there are a number here, if you would stand, my Board of Directors, especially Tony Park, our President, who's retiring this year. Thank you for your service. So, welcome to the 36th Annual Frank Church Conference, Democracy in an Age of Anxiety, Russian Intrusion, Chinese Confrontation, Populist Disruption. The Frank Church Institute includes these conferences, the Frank and Bethine Church Chair of Public Affairs, and the Frank Church Scholarships. You should know that we currently have 2 Boise State students studying in Washington, D.C. at the University of California Center, where they both have internships on Capitol Hill. All of these programs are named for one of Idaho's most distinguished leaders, Senator Frank Church. The Frank Church Institute represents those ideals which he held dear. Quote, a strong belief in the rule of law, eloquence firmly based on reason, and an unwavering faith in the American political system. So a special welcome this morning to Frank Church's granddaughter, Monica Church. Where are you? Monica has her supporters here. Many advanced placement high school students are with us today, and you will no doubt have many choices of where to attend college, but I hope you will consider Boise State University, especially the Global Studies program. Several months ago, Boise State welcomed its 7th president, Dr. Marlene Trump, who has literally hit the ground running. Unfortunately, she's taken ill this morning, but interim provost Tony Park is here in her place. So please help me welcome Tony Rourke. I've got 2 Tonys here. Tony Park, Tony Rourke.
With all apologies, Tony, there can never be too many Tonys, you know? Yeah. Well, good morning, and again, welcome to the 36th Annual Frank Church Conference. As Dr. Wensky said, my name is Tony Rourke. I'm the interim provost here at Boise State University. Louder? This will challenge my skills here. As Dr. Wensky said, President Trump was scheduled to welcome you here this morning, but she is under the weather. She asked that I share her regrets for missing this important event and that I give you her warmest welcome. So welcome on behalf of President Trump. As I'm sure you've noticed, we have a very impressive crowd here this morning. I recognize a number of students and faculty and staff from our School of Public Service and our Honors College, and I know that we have a very strong contingent from the community as well, and that's fantastic. I'm also impressed by the fact that there are more than 300 high school students here from the Boise School District, and that truly gives me a real sense of hope. You, our high school students and college students, are the next generation of our state leaders and our national leaders, and we place a great deal of trust in you. One mission of the Frank Church Institute is to examine and engage the public in the ideas and aspects of the American political system that Senator Church held most dear. This year's conference examines democracy in an age of anxiety, and seeing so many bright young people here this morning certainly helps to ease my own sense of anxiety. So thank you, students. I grew up on a farm in the middle of the Treasure Valley, and having lived the vast majority of my life in Idaho, Frank Church's name is imprinted on my psyche as indelibly as the silhouette of the Boise foothills and the smell of cottonwoods budding out by the Boise River in the springtime. Though much of his life's work was complete by the time I could appreciate its significance, the impact that he had on the state of Idaho and its people as a 4-term U.S. Senator was profound and lasting. Whether you're talking about his work with President Lyndon Johnson on the Civil Rights Act of 1957, his chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or his work and broad efforts relating to land and the environment, from Hell's Canyon to the Sawtooth to the eponymous River of No Return Wilderness, Frank Church changed Idaho, changed the nation, and changed the world. So it's quite fitting that we gather today on the Boise State campus where, as President Trump says, we change people's lives so that they can change the world. The Church family's own connection to the Boise State campus is notable. Bethine attended Boise Junior College in the 1950s, at the same time that Frank taught public speaking here. Their son Chase and granddaughter Monica, as Dr. Winsky said, are also Boise State graduates. And I want to give a shout out to Monica and her Boise High AP American Government class. I know there are a lot of you here, so shout out to you. Thanks for coming. And indeed, thank you all for coming here and being here, participating in the conference. I know you have quite a day in store with very stimulating presentations and panels with leading experts in the field. So on behalf of the leadership at Boise State, welcome to the 36th Annual Frank Church Conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony Rourke. And thank you also to the conference media sponsors who are up on the screens here, the Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and Boise State Public Radio. Our next speaker is well known to most of us. For the 16 years that David Beador has served as the mayor of the city of Boise, he has made it an annual tradition to open this conference. His presence is especially appreciated today as he faces some anxiety and democracy in the next month. His tenure as mayor includes Boise making many national lists as the most livable city in the country, or one of the most livable. Please join me in welcoming Mayor David Beador.
Well, good morning, everyone. What an honor it is for me to be here. As Gary mentioned, I've been able to come and welcome folks to begin the conference. And, this year in particular, Gary mentioned that President Trump hit the ground running when she came to Boise to be the president. And I happen to know that that is literally true. President Trump and I participated in a fun run recently, which for me is mostly an oxymoron. It was the 50th anniversary of the Boise Greenbelt. And it was a beautiful day and had a great crowd, and she and I began the run. And as we were talking, I said, "Can you take it easy on me? Can we go real slow?" "Oh, yeah, Dave, we'll just take it real easy." They hit the gun, we start out, and for about 50 yards, she took it easy, and then she took off running. And I had to settle in with some fifth graders from Taft Elementary School. So that hit the ground running metaphor is very appropriate for Dr. Trump. This topic, as it's been every year, could not be more timely. It just seems that every year the conference manages to come up with a topic and a quality of speaker that is just amazing, and that they can do it every year is even more so. Every day, especially over the past several days, headlines practically scream with anxiety I think we all feel for our democracy. And it's expressed, obviously, in the theme of the conference, perhaps not since the Civil War has our republic seemed so fragile. Strongmen and reactionary movements in power in our nation's capital and capitals all around the world are willfully dismantling, piece by piece, the institutions that helped create modern Western democracy out of the ashes of 2 civil wars. The military alliances, political confederations, and trade relationships that fostered the stability and prosperity that emerged from the World War II are being undermined. But despite the headlines and anxiety, there are things that tell me the fundamental goodness that underpins our society is still intact. Closest to home in Boise, we're actively involved in an effort that we call Boise Kind. We started Boise Kind about a year ago, at least in part because of these bigger pressures on the national and international stage. Boiseans have been known as a kind and welcoming city. They've been the calling card, and we've even gotten national recognition. But even here, we see how the narratives around these issues have crept into local conversations. Right here at Boise State, President Trump found herself having to fend off ridiculous assertions from state leaders, no less, that the university's many efforts to be inclusive, that's not, and I put quotes around it, the Idaho way. And just as President Trump has stood her ground, we must not let that kind of mentality go unchallenged. I know that President Trump couldn't be here this morning, but I think we need to take just a moment and recognize her for her commitment to inclusiveness and common decency. If we could have a round of applause. That's why at the city level our efforts at Boise Kind, to remind Boiseans of their fundamental nature of civility and inclusiveness and basic kindness that sometimes seems to be so lost in today's narrative. What gives me so much heart is the extraordinary response people have made to the Boise Kind effort. Thousands have responded in one way or another, and many organizations around the city, including the Boise School District, have picked it up and run with it. But even beyond our local efforts to hold the line for decency, I take heart in the fact that our democracy is in reality still an experiment, one that in the course of human history is still fairly new. Last year, the program for this conference had a quote from Senator Churchill himself that summed it up. He said, "America, long the world's most principled nation, has strayed in recent years from that tradition. But there is a shining promise for this nation now as there was in the beginning. Few nations have our capacity for self-redemption. Because we are a free and open society and determined to remain so, our errors can be examined soberly and corrected in time." Thanks again to the Frank Church Institute and Boise State for putting on such an amazing conference and bringing together this incredible talent that we're going to see over the course of this day. I hope all of you come away with some insight into how we can return to a world that looks forward rather than back. Thank you all very much. Here's to a great conference.
In your program, there's an insert with Ambassador McFault's bio. I hope many of you will come hear him this evening at 7 o'clock down the hall in the Jordan Ballroom. But on the back of that program is room for some information. We'd love to hear from you, especially to get your email contact so we can send you our newsletter, information about various speakers and programs, and keep you updated. The students, volunteers will collect those from you if you want to fill them out, and also make comments about what you're hearing today. Later this morning, during the panel discussions, you'll be able to ask questions, and there are mics up front here. You can line up at the direction of your panel moderator. Now let me introduce Steve Feldstein, who holds the Frank and Bethine Church Chair, who will frame today's conference topic. Steve previously served as counsel on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I also served, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I served in the State Department. Now he's at Boise State. He seems to be following me. So. Most recently, Steve published a major paper entitled "The Global Expansion of AI, Artificial Intelligence Surveillance." It was published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it was profiled in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming Steve Feldstein.
Hi, everyone. Before I actually give remarks, we're going to start with what we think is a pretty appropriate video from Frank Church. It's a Meet the Press interview that he gave in 1975, and actually I think it does a really good job of previewing some of the issues we'll be talking about today. So we'll screen that, and then I will offer some framing remarks right after.
Well, Senator, let me follow up by asking, do you think that the CIA and military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the Federal Preparedness Agency it's called now, to have contingency plans which threaten the liberty of American citizens?
Mr. Rowan, in due course, the committee will pass judgment on those questions. I'm not going to pre-guess the committee or prematurely attempt to pass judgment on this program. But let me tell you this. In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea, they could be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now, that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. Now, why is this investigation important? I'll tell you why. Because I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return.
Well, Senator, let me military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the federal preparedness.
Good. All right. Well, you know, I think we selected that video clip, in part because I think it demonstrates that in 1975, many years ago, many decades ago, even then, with Frank Church in his prime, there was a lot of concern about the state of democracy and a lot of churn about where we were going and what kind of checks and balances and oversight were needed in terms of ensuring the strength and durability and popular representation in our own country. And so even as we sort of think about the theme today, democracy in an age of anxiety, I think many of the same types of overwhelming sentiments persist. And so just as we were able to sort of think about those and really grapple with them 40 plus years ago, I think we are also at an age right now where we must also confront and grapple and deal with some of these major public policy issues with our own democracy. So I want to provide a few framing remarks before we go into our panels. This is now my third conference, Frank Church Institute conference. The first one I participated in 2017 was entitled America's Future, Refugees, Migration, and National Security. We were not even a year into Trump's presidency, but we were already living through the first of many self-inflicted crises then. Last year's conference focused on the global struggle for democracy. It featured Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State, who delivered the university's distinguished lecture. Ken Wallach, former president of NDI, delivered the lunchtime address, offering lessons from his decades of experience in the field. While I had high hopes that the conference would solve the global democracy crisis, alas, there's still a lot of work to do. This year's conference then returns to a similar theme. Democracy in an age of anxiety, looking at different factors that are really causing us concern when it comes to governance around the world, not just at home. Our idea for this year's conference was to build off the big themes from last year, but to go a little deeper. We sought to bring in experts who can probe and examine what China's global ambition, Russia's aggressive resentment, and a wave of populist autocrats from Turkey to the Philippines means for the future of democracy. But I would be remiss if I didn't begin by addressing the elephant in the room. Our democracy at home is also facing a crisis. As we speak, we are in the midst of a slow-moving constitutional crisis whose outcome is not clear. Regardless of your political affiliation, as Americans, we should be worried. With polarization fully capturing our discourse, making our political class unable to see beyond short-term tactical gains, the result is troubling. What precedent are we setting for accountability and corruption in the country? What message are we sending future generations about the strength and resilience of U.S. institutions? Not to mention the cherished principles that no person sits above the law. The esteemed democracy scholar Larry Diamond wrote that slow political descents have a way of lulling us into complacency. He observed, quote, "Things aren't so bad, we tell ourselves. They're just slipping a bit." In Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, the freewheeling, hard-drinking Mike Campbell is asked how he went bankrupt. 2 ways, he said, gradually and then suddenly. The demise of democracy is often like that too. So I believe that our domestic problems are deeply connected to the larger crisis facing democracies around the world. To fight for his political survival, President Trump is calling into question the very legitimacy of those opposing his conduct. He's willing to tear down longstanding institutions and abrogate constitutional norms if it means he can stay in power. But these are not original tactics. Authoritarian regimes and illiberal democracies grapple with these issues all the time. As we'll talk about today, just look at the strategies deployed by Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil to remain in power. But it is highly unusual for an advanced democracy to find itself embroiled in a similar scenario, essentially held captive by the impulses of intransigent behavior of its leader. So I want to offer 3 ideas to help navigate this landscape and frame the discussions we will have in our morning panels. First, democracies are increasingly threatened by leaders who wield polarization as a core political strategy. That is to say, leaders who purposely intensify partisan emotions, deliberately highlight divisive issues, and use crude insults to disparage and delegitimize opponents, and discard prior restraints and constitutional boundaries. The good news is that polarization can ease. As Tom Carruthers, another democracy expert recently observed, countries which manage to turn back polarization are typically those where a sharply divisive figure has left the scene and his or her successors are able to walk back the corrosive partisanship. Ecuador is an example cited where the new president, Moreno, has backed away from the anti-democratic stance of his predecessor. Unfortunately, in the United States, partisanship did not arrive with Donald Trump. It has been a continuous feature of our politics for 5 decades. Trump's eventual departure may moderate America's polarization ills, but it will not cure the problem. Second, we're going to talk about China's rise as a strategic competitor to the United States and to the degree to which China presents a formidable challenge to democracies. Now, some maintain that China is pushing forward an alternative system of governance to supplant democracies. I think this case is somewhat overstated, but we should not dismiss how China's rise undermines democratic and liberal values around the globe. Let's take a small example from last week. The NBA tweet heard around the world from Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey. For those who missed it, Morey retweeted an image showing support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters that include the words, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." Unsurprisingly, China's government went ballistic. China's state broadcaster announced it would stop showing NBA games. The Chinese Basketball Association, led by former Rocket star Yao Ming, also severed ties. In the same week, Chinese authorities purged South Park from streaming sites and social media pages after a recent episode mocked how Hollywood studios create content these days in fears of Chinese censorship. Chinese authorities also pressured Apple to remove the HKMap.live app from its app store, claiming that the program was allowing protesters to attack the police in Hong Kong. In fact, the app mostly helps citizens avoid police skirmishes or helps protesters avoid mass detention dragnets by increasingly authoritarian security forces. So what does China propose as an appropriate standard for free speech? Take it from CCTV, the Chinese state broadcaster. Quote, "We believe any remarks that challenge national sovereignty and social stability do not belong to the category of free speech." Arguably, this would apply to almost all speech. Of course, as we'll discuss in the first panel, China's anti-democratic policies extend beyond policing corporate content. My own research indicates that Chinese companies with significant financial support from the state are actively marketing sophisticated public safety surveillance systems around the world. This includes states with known histories of human rights abuses such as Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Uganda, and Pakistan. Chinese social networks such as WeChat and Weibo aggressively censor user content that dares to criticize the Chinese state. They enable authorities to flag, collect, store millions of conversations both domestically and overseas. And let's not forget China's mass detention efforts in Xinjiang. An estimated 1.5 million Uyghurs and other Muslims are being held in re-education centers in the region. They are subject to torture, forced labor, and mass indoctrination. Third, Russian efforts to undercut democracies are very real and damaging. While some experts describe China's anti-democratic efforts as a stealth offensive, there is nothing discreet about Russia's playbook. Under Putin's leadership, they are actively sowing division, fomenting social and racial unrest, and subverting the legitimacy of major liberal democracies. Russian agents are using asymmetric digital strategies like disinformation campaigns to undermine voting and elections, but it's not just in the digital realm. As the New York Times reported last week, Russian agents are also relying upon time-honored tactics like nerve agent attacks in the UK, coup attempts in Montenegro, and poisonings in Bulgaria to destabilize European democracies. Unlike with China, I personally believe that Russia's aggressive actions are a desperate attempt by Putin to distract his citizens from rampant corruption and precipitous decline hastened by his regime. Yet, Russian operations have brought real damage. They are sustaining extreme parties like the far-right Alternative for Germany, Italy's Lega Party, and France's National Front. More insidiously, Russia is advancing a broader assault on truth itself, a, quote, war against reality. They are reinforcing the argument again and again that democratic governments and political leaders cannot be believed nor trusted. So, where does this leave us? Certainly with a lot of questions. At heart, I do remain an optimist. While the troubles facing democracies can appear overwhelming, I also strongly believe in the resilience of democratic systems and the ability to self-correct. The old adage, it's never as good as it looks and it's never as bad as it seems, rings true today. Just as Obama's election in 2008 led people to prematurely claim that America had this, much of Frank Church's tenure was bedeviled by similarly intractable issues. We were able to find a path forward then, and I believe we can do the same now. So I'm very excited to delve into these questions and hear from our panelists today that we have, especially those we have lined up this morning. We have a really stellar lineup. Rob Burzynski, Irene Petranto, David Ashmore, James Churchill are among those joining us from the outside who will offer their knowledge and wisdom and take your questions to the audience today. Our first panel will explore democracy and the China question. What are Chinese intentions? How is advanced technology undergirding China's political aims and expanding its influence? Our second panel will take a deep look at Russia and unpack methods, tactics, and strategies Putin is deploying to counteract liberal democracies. In the afternoon, we have organized 3 separate breakout sessions, which I hope many of you will be able to stay for and join, so that people can engage in more intimate conversations on these important issues. And of course, our lunchtime keynote by Rob Burzynski and our evening keynote by Ambassador Michael McFaul will further elaborate on these trends. So without further ado, let me turn over the floor to my colleague, Dr. Nisha Bellinger, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boise State University. She will moderate our first panel. So thank you for your time and for participating today. I look forward to a robust discussion.
Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to the 36th Annual Frank Church Conference. I'm Nisha Bellinger, Assistant Professor of the School of Public Service, and I will be moderating the first panel discussion titled Democracy and the China Question. We have a distinguished group of panelists here, and it is my pleasure to introduce them to you. I'll start with our out-of-town guest. To my left is Irene Petranto. Irene is a senior researcher for the Citizen Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She's also pursuing a doctoral degree at the University of Toronto. Her primary research interest is analyzing cybersecurity policy development in the Global South from a human rights perspective, including issues like internet governance and the politics of internet regulation, as well as countering hate speech online, among others. She obtained her master's degree in Asia-Pacific Studies from the University of Toronto, and a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. Irene, welcome to Boise State University. To my right is David Ashmore, who is our next panelist. David has been an in-house attorney at Micron since May 1999, handling a variety of intellectual property and antitrust litigations. Most recently, he was involved in Micron's litigations against Chinese state-owned enterprise Xinhua, and their technology partner UMC, both of whom were criminally indicted in 2018 by the US Department of Justice for trade secret theft from Micron. David received his BA from Harvard and his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Welcome, David, to Boise State University. Our third panelist you've heard from already is Stephen Feldstein, but I'm happy to reintroduce him to you with some more detail. He is the holder of Frank and Church Chair of Public Affairs and an associate professor at Boise State University. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program. Previously, he served in various capacities at the US Department of State and the director of the Office of Policy at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He has also served as counsel on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His research interests include technology, democracy, human rights, U.S. foreign policy, and conflict trends. He's currently writing a book on the intersection of advanced technology, global repression, and governance. He received his BA from Princeton and JD from Berkeley Law. Thank you, Steve, for appearing on this panel with us. And then lastly, I'm Nisha Bellinger, Assistant Professor of Political Science in the School of Public Service. My research focuses on global politics and how it affects global health outcomes. I hold BA and MA degrees from India and a PhD from Missouri. Thank you to all three of our panelists here who've taken their time to share their expertise. And I'm very pleased to be a part of this panel. With that, let's get started. So this panel, as you know, focuses around the theme of democracy and the China question. And it relates to important global developments as well as things that are going on closer to home in the United States. The 2019 Freedom in the World report, which analyzes quality of democracy globally, mentions that global democracy has been in decline for the 13th consecutive year, with 68 countries in 2018 exhibiting decline in democracy. This reiterates Stephen's opening remarks as well. Against this global backdrop, we see China asserting its influence abroad in several ways. How is China using technology to do so? How does China's model of governance influence global democracy? Irene and Steve will shed light on these questions. Closer to home, as you may know, economic relations between China and the United States have been strained in recent times. There is an ongoing trade dispute between the two countries. How does it affect the private sector in the US? And what does it mean for economic relations between the two countries moving forward? David and Steve will help address these questions. With that, I'll get started with my first question, which is directed to Irene and Steve. So how is China trying to leverage its use of technology via social media or other means to extend its influence among Asian countries and beyond? And then additionally, how does its use of technology promote China's larger strategic goals to assert its power and influence? And I'll turn to Irene to perhaps shed light on certain countries in Asia, and then Steve can address it from a global perspective.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nisha, for the introduction. Thank you to Stephen, Gary Wency, and Chase Johnson for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's my first time in Idaho, and I'm very excited to be here. So as Nisha mentioned, I work at the Citizen Lab. So we are a research lab looking at the intersection of cybersecurity and human rights. And so China is definitely a country of interest to us, just as other countries in the global south, because we see that China is expanding its influence and trying to counter US dominance and Western dominance in general globally. So I think I'll begin with, I guess, giving context as to where does this sit in terms of like China's strategy and why is technology a crucial part of their strategy in terms of challenging Western dominance. So China has a plan called Made in China 2025. So that's a state-led industrial policy that seeks to make China dominant in global high-tech manufacturing. So if you've ever heard the term of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, this is what they're intending to do. So that refers to the integration of big data, cloud computing, and other emerging technologies into their global manufacturing supply chain. And so Chinese policymakers is drawing inspiration from, so the German government, they also have an Industry 4.0 development plan. And the ultimate goal is to reduce China's dependence on foreign technology and to promote Chinese high-tech manufacture in the global marketplace. So for instance, semiconductors, that's a huge priority for them. Now the problem is that for the United States and other major industrialized democracies is that the tactics that Beijing in pursuit of these goals not only undermine international trade rules, but also pose security risk because their policy relies on discriminatory treatment of foreign investment, forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and cyber espionage. And foreign companies operating in China recently, because the cybersecurity law that was passed is going to come into force on December 1st. So foreign companies operating in China are coming under investigation over cybersecurity violations, according to Beijing. And also, the fact that China built products that are at least complicit with its social surveillance and censorship system also pose problems for Western liberal democracies. So Nisha, so how exactly are they doing this, right? Like what methods or what tactics do they use? So investment is definitely key, and this is where countries in the global south, countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, that's where these countries become important for China to expand. Because they are increasingly becoming saturated at home, and so to continue being profitable, they have to look overseas. So according to Xi Jinping, his vision is for China to become a global cyber power by 2035. So that's why establishing China as a global power in cyberspace has emerged as a key national policy, especially since the creation of the Cyberspace Administration in China in 2014, which is headed by President Xi Jinping himself. So as I said, investments are key, both to obtain knowledge in technology and also to build capacity and to increase market share. So one region that I'll speak to in particular is Southeast Asia. So I'm from Indonesia originally, although now I'm based in Canada. And Southeast Asia is a key region for China, and I would argue for the rest of the world as well, because it is where almost 10% of the world's population reside. It has 640 million people. For Asia Pacific, there's about 4.4 billion people. So when you're talking about the future of technology, Asia and Southeast Asia in particular are really important regions to consider. So China shares its borders with 14 sovereign states. 3 of them are in Southeast Asia: Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar. And China has advantages in the region in comparison to the United States, for instance, because it has deep ties to the region, it has cultural linkages, and close overlap with the business community. So aside from its big population, its youthful population, I think the median age is about 29 years old. So as you can imagine, when you are trying to promote technology, so for instance, China has its own Twitter, Sina Weibo, which Steve mentioned. It has its own search engine, etc. So as you can imagine, for the Chinese government, when they're trying to push Chinese companies overseas, a region like Southeast Asia with its youthful population, its big size, become really important. So over the past 5 years, and with the government's help, China's tech giants have become household names in Southeast Asia. So Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent now have a combined market capitalization of over $1 trillion. And I think this is, I guess, a form of challenging Western dominance, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the app Tik-Tok. Does anybody use that? Because they're high school students. There you go. Okay. So Tik-Tok is quickly supplanting Facebook, for instance, in Asia. So Tik-Tok allows you to create 15-second videos, right, that will then go viral or turn to a meme or something like that. And so in the future, we will likely see American internet companies, social media platforms becoming, supplanted or replaced by Chinese technology companies. So for instance, recently I was scolded by my grandmother who uses Line instead of WhatsApp, and that's a Japanese company. And so I think in the future this will likely continue to happen, and I think it's a form of challenging Western dominance that China is up to using internet and social media platform.
Great. I think that was a really good exposition by Irene. I'll just offer a few broader comments on kind of the strategic challenge that China presents before turning it back over to Nisha. I think first it's important to understand or just think about the underlying condition when it comes to the relationship between the United States and China, in the sense that you do have somewhat of a geopolitical inevitability where you have one country, the United States, which has been sort of the global hegemon and sort of a dominant superpower for a number of years. And then you have a rising power represented by China on all fronts, whether it's military, economic, and so forth, that is both trying to preserve the gains that it's made and also assert influence and ensure that it's able to continue its trajectory. And so no matter what kind of political system China would have, I think there is an inevitability that there would be friction in that relationship. But that then leads to the second point, which is that, as it turns out, China has a political system and a set of political values that are very different from ours. It's an authoritarian system, a closed authoritarian system. And then with Xi Jinping, the current president, you have an even greater turn towards some of those autocratic tendencies. And so I think that is serving to ramp up tensions even further. So I think one of the questions, though, we really need to ask ourselves is, to what extent, how systematic is this sort of the technological advance that Irene's describing when it comes to spreading applications that offer this China state the ability to surveil citizens, both its own citizens as well as citizens around the world, when it's exporting certain types of technology that are then used by autocratic governments towards repressive means, when it comes to other methods, especially those that are technologically oriented, in which to spread its influence. How much is that something that's part of a broader strategy, and how much is that something that we can best understand more on a case-by-case basis? And my argument would be that to really get to a closer understanding of what this means, you have to go to individual countries and really kind of dig a level deeper. So, one thing I think that's important is that China on its own is not spreading repression without having an underlying regime or political culture that already is prone to leaning in that direction. So look at a place like Thailand or Cambodia, where you already have a movement towards and a long tradition of repression. What Chinese technology can offer, it can essentially help to serve as an accelerant of some of these trends. It can make more efficient certain repressive modes and strategies. It can allow for these countries to obtain and acquire different types of technology that can facilitate further repression. But is this a situation where, but for China's involvement, you would otherwise have illiberal or even thriving democracies? I don't see that. And so that's where I think it's important for us to sort of see how these pieces match up. Now, I think it is also important to be clear that it's more than just a supplying of technology by Chinese firms to autocratic countries that we're talking about. I mean, there is very much a linkage between subsidies provided by the Chinese state, protective practices at home, which David, I'm sure, will talk about, and by home I mean in the Chinese domestic market, and then sort of linkages to initiatives like the Belton Road Initiative, which is part of a very deliberate commercial economic expansion initiative around the world to implant Chinese products in different markets. And I think that deserves our attention and thought when it comes to what effect and impact that has geopolitically, as well as in terms of promoting an alternative set of politics in different places. So why don't I stop there and turn it over?
Steve, thank you. Irene, thank you. And Irene, she brought up Made in China 2025, which leads me to my second question, which is directed to David. So Made in China 2025 was announced by China in 2015. what is Made in China 2025? Irene gave some details, but David, if you'd like to share more insight about that. But more importantly, how might it affect the private sector in the United States?
Sure. Let me start by thanking the panel and thanking Steve for inviting me. I am looking forward to seeing how Steve's going to weave the experience of one local IP attorney into the story about a rise of authoritarianism and threats to democracy. Let me start also by noting that my comments here today are my own and they don't reflect the views officially or unofficially of Micron. I don't have the authority to speak for the company and don't want to leave anyone with that misimpression. That said, let me try to pick up on what Irene said about Made in China 2025. So first, the industries that are affected. There are a number of high-tech industries affected. I'll just name a few. Telecommunications, avionics, robotics, AI, electric cars, and most important from Micron's perspective is semiconductor memories. That's our business. And the means of implementing Made in China 2025 include mass state subsidization, mobilization of state-owned enterprises, and ultimately the acquisition of intellectual property by any means necessary. Now, acquisition of intellectual property certainly would include legitimate acquisitions of intellectual property through purchases where available, but also, unfortunately for Micron, have included trade secret theft, criminal trade secret theft, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. One other thought, the goal for Made in China 2025 is, as Irene noted, to reduce China's dependence on foreign technology. In particular, the goal is by 2025 to have over 70% of the purchases of the equipment of those targeted industries come from domestically owned and controlled companies. In the case of semiconductor memories, that goal of being able to get from where China was at the time of 2015 of zero, complete, starting from scratch, to having a developed industry that could support 70% of their internal consumption of semiconductor memories is extremely difficult, if not impossible, without acquisition or theft. So there are problems with the ability. It's very difficult for China to actually legitimately obtain semiconductor memory technology for a variety of reasons, some involving US regulations, some just involving the fact that the structure of the industry is there are very few suppliers. It's a scale economy, which leaves China, if the state-owned enterprises that had been mobilized to achieve this goal with fewer choices other than to look to stealing the technology. Let me pause there.
Thank you, David. And so, Steve, I will turn to you now. And if you could talk to us and more broadly in terms of how this might affect current economic interactions between US and China now as well as moving forward.
Sure. I mean, I think there's been a lot of developments, and I'd be curious to kind of hear both my panelists' sort of feedback on this. But just in the last, I guess, 2 weeks, a number of different Chinese AI companies have been placed on the U.S. entities list, actually for human rights reasons, because of their involvement in the mass detention and brutal repression campaign taking place in Xinjiang. Now, there are a lot of reasons potentially for this. From what I understand, this is the first time that human rights as a rationale has been used to actually place significant Chinese companies on the entities list. So that in of itself, I think, is a positive in terms of actually demanding publicly some sort of accountability for how this technology is being used to systematically repress. So good. It also comes in the midst of an ongoing trade war that we're having, and in the midst of more specific negotiations that have happened, and what seems to be sort of a relatively successful, at least by Chinese standards, end to phase one of the negotiations. So how all that sort of plays in together, I think, will be interesting. I mean, certainly what I've seen from my own perspective going to Washington, D.C., talking to different staff on the Hill as well as in the executive branches, is that there is a growing recognition, I think, that there needs to be better ways to both control and really decouple U.S. technology from some Chinese companies, especially those that are exporting and using technology in ways that we don't agree with. Huawei is one of the companies that I think has been front and center for a lot of people when it comes to what Huawei's intentions are, whether their building out of infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure, represents a national security threat in the long run, and what kind of exploits, backdoors, and other sorts of vulnerabilities they might put in place when it comes to technology that they are establishing. And so part of that then feeds into this kind of broader narrative. You know, if Huawei is sort of a branch of the Chinese state or is sort of very closely related to that, and there is concern generally when it comes to the strategic presence of China and how it affects our U.S. interests, that then really bleeds over, spills over into the economic realm, and it's hard to separate out the national security from the economics on all of these fronts. So it gets complicated, but it seems to me that there is increasing political momentum towards linking the two together and using different tools that we have, from entities lists to trade negotiations to other just even sort of diplomatic warnings of the effect of Huawei 5G and so forth around the world as it relates to our broader geopolitical concerns.
The only thing I would like to add to that is that China is trying to move from an economy that produces commodities using low-skilled labor, so clothes, toys, to an economy that uses high-skilled labor. So in the future, we see China competing not just with the United States, but other countries around the world that are equally trying to produce commodities using high-skilled labor. So relations between US and China and between China and other developed countries may be strained moving forward, especially when it comes to how China is using, how the state is using its power to assist the private sector in trying to push through this 2025 plan moving forward. With that, I will switch back gears to the question of democracy, and I'll turn to Irene and Steve again. Is China presenting a distinct model of governance, both domestically and abroad, and what does it mean for the spread of democracy globally?
Please.
So I guess I'll speak about, I'll try to answer that question from the perspective of internet, technology and social media platform. So in terms of the Chinese conception of cybersecurity, I would argue that it is distinct from what the US and other Western liberal democracies are putting forward, in that they believe in what is called information security. So it's not just about network security. So this means that they are just as concerned about the content that is being transmitted as they do about the integrity of the networks themselves. So how do they present this model of governance, right? One that is concerned with information security and one that is predominantly state-led. So one example that they have done that is at the UN, which is of course a global forum. So they have proposed what's called the International Code of Conduct for Information Security, or what can be called the Code. So that's an international effort to develop norms of behavior in the digital space, and they submitted it to the UN General Assembly first in 2011 and then again in 2015. And so what is the code, right? So the code emphasizes state sovereignty and territoriality in the digital space above all else, and is dominated by intelligence, national security, and regime stability imperatives. So this is a norm, a code that is proposed by China and Russia, and also by members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So in essence, they believe in a state-driven authoritarian approach to cyberspace. As the title of the conference suggests, right, we live in an age of anxiety. A lot of governments around the world are concerned with fake news, however so defined, with rumors, hoaxes. So as you can imagine, in many parts of the world who are also confronting these problems, the Chinese approach is finding a lot of resonance, right? Especially in countries that have weak rule of law, weak democratic institutions, and have multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural populations, because the concern is that, when rumors are being circulated in encrypted apps like, for instance, WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal, that it could trigger, conflicts, civil war even, or even secessionist movements. So I'll let Steve comment on that.
Yeah, no, just to build on that, I think there's a few things that, let's hold this for a second, that we need to sort of think about when it comes to what effect China, particularly on the technology side, has on sort of democracy worldwide, some of which I've talked about. So, one of them is just that the basic fact is that, we essentially have the separation of the internet and associated applications into two very distinct domains. You have kind of the broader kind of non-Chinese domain, where people are free to use all sorts of platforms, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Google searches, and so forth. And then you have within China its own specific applications and programs. And what's particularly relevant about that is that those programs are heavily censored and circumscribed in terms of content. So not only are distinct narratives filtered out by the Chinese state to ensure that its citizens can only access a certain perspective, but it also means you start to develop sort of more distinct worldviews. And I think a lot of that you can sort of see come to a head in a place like Hong Kong, where on mainland China, the protesters are very unpopular. There's a very strong nationalistic sentiment, and I think in part that's due to the fact that a full, complete airing of what the protesters are calling for and how the political situation developed to that point hasn't really been heard. And so that shows you what you can do when you have a curated internet that the state in which the state wields a heavy hand. And that ought to be concerning. I also think that what China kind of allows is that it allows sort of an alternative forum to countries that are illiberal or autocratic leaning. So, if they are looking to access certain technology, if they are looking to implement certain types of surveillance, and they're unable to acquire that type of capacity from Western firms, which have certain standards they must abide by, or so on, they have sort of a right of appeal to Chinese companies or to the Chinese state, and that can help in terms of repression worldwide. So in countries that already may have a leaning or an inclination towards certain types of autocratic policies, China can help to accelerate and be an expedient towards moving to that further. And then, I think there's also the idea that there is a wide sort of pressure campaign when it comes to U.S. companies, Western companies, and how they operate, and the delicate balance that they face between, on the one hand, wanting to access the Chinese market and its billions of revenue, and on the other hand, ensuring that the ability to conform to kind of core political values of freedom of expression and so forth can be maintained. And China is very clear about pushing back and trying to take away some of those avenues of expression when it feels it's crossing its national interests. For example, any sort of references to Taiwan are oftentimes viewed as part of that line crossing. So.
Can I just?
Yes.
Sorry, I'll just give one example to what Steve has mentioned. So I mentioned the app called Tik-Tok earlier. So that's a Chinese app, right? That I said is growing in popularity around the world. So according to TikTok's local moderation guidelines, because it is a Chinese company, so they ban any content that could be seen as positive to gay people or gay rights, even pictures or 15-second videos of same-sex couples holding hands, even in countries where homosexuality has never been illegal. So I think that just goes to show how a Chinese company that operates according to I guess, like Chinese standards of morality, so to speak, when they grow globally, they still have to abide by Chinese content standards, right? So what does that mean to free speech elsewhere in China? And does that mean that then China is the speech police for the world as their apps grow in popularity?
Thank you. The only thing I would like to add to that, for one, Steve mentioned Hong Kong, and very recently I think they pulled the plug on one of Apple's apps that was being used in Hong Kong to get people to try to coordinate the protests that are taking place. And so that relates to the way it's using its own technology in a place. I mean, Hong Kong is not its own independent country. However, China has a lot of influence over Hong Kong. On a slightly different note, what we see also in China is that there is some civil society that exists. So not all types of civil society is completely suppressed. For instance, the kind of governance that is especially unique there is when people try to protest the government. That is the kind of protest that is especially suppressed by the government. However, civil society actors who are working with international aid agents to provide, let's say, health services to the population, those are still allowed to exist within the country. So it's sort of unique in terms of it's not complete suppression, but selective suppression. And we see that perhaps to an extent in Hong Kong, that has, where China has a lot of influence, but also Singapore, another country in the region, which is opening up. It has other opposition parties that are able to run for elections. However, at the same time, it's still sort of considered a non-democracy as China.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just wanted to say, particularly in light of the clip we saw earlier from Senator Church with the warning he delivered, and also because I guess it's, you know, it's super Orwellian and just downright creepy. I wonder if Steve or Irene could talk about the social credits program in China that is rolling out.
I'm happy to, unless you want to.
No, go ahead. I can jump in.
I'm not an expert in social credit, but I've talked to enough people and done enough reading and analysis of it that I have just a couple viewpoints. I mean, social credit, in terms of its ultimate aspiration, should, you know, create a lot of concern when it comes to its kind of end goal of linking together different databases and pools of information related to individuals to ultimately allow a ranking based on social behavior of how how much a person is conforming, or even a company is conforming to certain Chinese state political objectives. Now, the thing I understand is that social credit is one of those things that's much more aspirational than actual reality at the moment. And so some people like to say, for example, that it's not that much different than having a financial credit agency in the United States rank people in terms of their own amount of money and debts and assets that they have and so forth. But I think the difference is that this is meant to extend far beyond just financial actions into the realm of the political and the social. So you can foresee, I think, a moment where such a system, if it was integrated correctly and got past Chinese bureaucracy, which is legendary in its own right, could actually be a way to really monitor to a much higher degree than we've seen the behavior of citizens in the country. I do want to say that my understanding is that we're pretty far removed from getting to that point yet, that it's very much siloed and fragmented, and it's much more rhetoric at the moment than reality, but certainly the capacity to get there exists.
So if you have Netflix, you might have seen Black Mirror, the series. So there's a Black Mirror episode that is, I guess, exemplifies what social credit would look like in action, right? So in this Black Mirror episode, so let's say I buy coffee from Steve, then I would rank my interaction with Steve. Did he smile? Was he friendly enough, right? Do I like Steve, right? And I would assign a score to him. So that, I guess, in essence, is what, as Steve mentioned, social credit aspires to be. So as Steve mentioned as well, it is a pilot testing, at least that's what we know of at the moment. So it assigns citizens unofficial credit scores, and it's measured by not just the credit history, but also behavioral habits, the ability to pay off debts, personal information, and activity in social networks. There's a great episode, I think it's by ABC Australia on YouTube if you want to take a look at how the Chinese social credit system works. But it's very pervasive, right? So if let's say, the popular payment app in China is Alipay, for instance, and the social credit uses information gathered from Alipay, so the transactions that you use using your phone, your Alipay to pay for, it integrates that into the social credit system. So for instance, if you are a young woman and you go to the supermarket and you buy diapers, your score goes up because that means that, oh, you're a responsible young woman with a baby. But if, let's say, you are a young person, you go to the store and you buy liquor, your score goes down, right? And so it links everything that you do to this scoring system. And what is its impact, right? So if, let's say, your score is low enough, when you try to buy train tickets to go home to see your family during the holidays, you won't be able to because you're penalized for your whatever irresponsible lifestyle, right? So this is essentially what the social credit aims to do. And and then behavioral preferences that it looks at, for instance, include how timely are you with your bill payments? What is your occupation? What is your educational history? And then obviously, China for a long time had the one-child policy. So what happens when you go out and you try to date? Well, you compare your social credit system, your social credit score, right? Because if you have a score of a certain level, then you don't want to marry someone who has a lower score, right? So as you can imagine, this system, if it does get implemented, would have very, very wide-ranging ramifications from like practical things, whether you're allowed to travel or not, to basically who you marry, right? So, but as Steve mentioned, this is still a pilot program in the future, and as David mentioned, it is very, dystopian.
Can I throw a question back at David? So, obviously you deal a lot on the economic side with China. Are things like the social credit system on the radar for multinational companies as something in the future to consider, to be worried about? How much are you all thinking about that?
Unfortunately, not much. I mean, is the basic answer. I mean, I do wonder. I mean, I was in Shanghai last month when I was talking with one of our Chinese counsel about this program, where I first learned about it, really. And I wonder whether or not the counsel who represents Micron in litigation against Chinese companies, whether he's going to get dinged in the social credit system for representing. Sorry. Yeah, was saying I wonder whether or not a attorney who represents Micron in a litigation against a Chinese state-owned enterprise would get a social credit ding for doing that. I don't know, but the short answer is, as you guys have alluded, it hasn't really rolled out yet. We've got our hands full with things that are fully in place that we're dealing with. So,
but I also I understand that, already you're seeing with companies like Apple and others that there's sort of implicit rankings that may be ascribed to how much they're conforming to Chinese policies, right? So for example, there was the issue with the airlines about naming Taiwan, I think, within certain manifests, or whether they should sort of refer to it by another name. And so they changed that because of Chinese pressure. And I guess one of the ideas for the future with social credit would be that companies are also part of social credit in terms of them actually being rank ordered in terms of how much they are conforming or not.
Right.
So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
I'll just add one more thing. So as much as, for us in the West, it seems very dystopian and big brotherly, right? Like having something like a social credit system. From what I heard from people who live in China, they view this as a good thing. The title of the event is In an Age of Anxiety, right? I think everyone's anxious. Young people are anxious about dating. Like policymakers are anxious about, the state of I guess, their governance system, whatever that might be. And so social credit system is viewed by many as a means of reinstating trust between citizens and local businesses, and with their government even. And so I think there's a tension there in terms of, okay, we live in an age of anxiety, what are the appropriate remedies of that? And for many of them in China, for many people who live in China, a social credit system is viewed as almost necessary.
I wonder if it comes with certain benefits from the government. So is it easier to get loans if you have a higher social credit? And this is yet another way in which technology is being used to adhere to a certain type of behavior where all societies have social norms, but this is coming from the government, and perhaps a more efficient way to get people to adhere to a certain type of behavior. Thank you. Let me shift gears again and focus on US-China relations. So I'll direct my next question to David. In November 2018, the Justice Department launched the China Initiative to counter Chinese national security threats by prosecuting trade secret and intellectual property theft by China. Which sectors in the US are primarily affected by such thefts? And then follow-up for Steve after that, how does it affect economic relations between the two countries, broadly speaking?
Sure. So this initiative was announced by Attorney General Sessions in the same speech as he announced the indictment decision of this Chinese state-owned enterprise that we mentioned earlier, Jinhua, that had been indicted. The announced decision was an indictment decision in the U.S. Northern District of California for trade secret thefts from Micron, and at the same time that entity, Jinhua, was placed on this Department of Commerce entities list that some of you may have heard of. And being placed on the entities list effectively restricts the ability of any company to deliver what's termed U.S. origin technology to that company without a license from the Department of Commerce, which would be, the licenses are presumptively denied. So essentially blocks doing business with this company. So that all happened in one day. The initiative you mentioned, I think, was launched broadly enough that it should essentially affect any industry where there is valuable intellectual property. Trade secret theft was one of the #1 targets of this initiative, but there's also mention in the rollout of more vague protections of national security. But interestingly, I don't think there's any mention of a goal of targeting human rights abuses in this, and as Steve mentioned, we saw that justification for the first time last week.
Thank you. Yeah, Steve, if you want to weigh in.
I'll just make it bigger, sort of a broader point. But I think what's really interesting about sort of the economic political side is that really the sort of modern, more recent relationship between the United States and China was essentially contingent on a bet that our political leaders made a number of decades ago with China, which is that if we open up our markets to each other, if we work with them to help build up their companies and interlink our economies and incorporate Chinese suppliers into the global supply chain, that ultimately this would lead to significant political benefits that would have a positive spillover effect when it came to bringing China closer to kind of the international, the Western liberal order, and eventually opening them up, leading to political liberalization and moving them closer to being a democracy. So now we're in a moment right now where I think a lot of people are sort of turning their back on that idea. And part of sort of turning our back on the idea is exploring some of the sort of basic fundamentals that we've kind of pursued economically over the last few decades. And what I mean by that is sort of rethinking whether there are ways to decouple Chinese companies from the supply chain, move manufacturers to other countries that are viewed as either less of a threat or have governance systems that we think are more favorable or closer to the kind of U.S. liberal, democratic model. And that's, that's not something that's very easy to do. I think there will continue to be a high economic cost to doing so. B, I'm not even sure, and maybe David can provide some insight into this, whether that's even possible. in terms of kind of completely uprooting, decades of work to establish the right standards, factory, norms and so forth, and all of a sudden say, well, we're going to move to Vietnam, or we're going to move somewhere else where we think geopolitically it makes more sense. I don't know how one does that without significant economic pain. At the same time, the more you have major companies, Chinese companies that are put on different entities lists, the more you have, I think, sharper lawsuits and other actions that target Chinese trade practices, the more you are sort of nudging the system in a different direction. And I think that has broad political implications.
Yeah, let me pick up on part of what you said, which is what's really the converse of what you were suggesting. Well, first let me say, yes, it would be extremely painful and disruptive for Micron to disengage from China. We have upstream suppliers, we have back-end manufacturing there, we have a huge proportion of our customers are either located there or have, manufacturing facilities there or manufacturers of their own there, like Apple has all of their iPhones assembled in China. Apple is a big customer of ours. But on the flip side of that, so let's take, for example, the export control remedy I mentioned before. The reason that's such an effective remedy today is because, in the case of Genhua, it is essentially impossible for them to get in the business without access to suppliers of equipment to make these products that have U.S. origin technology in them. So they're effectively shut down while they're on the entities list. They can't get in this business, which is an effective remedy today, and it mitigates the loss of the trade secrets that they have stolen from us. On the other hand, it certainly increases the incentives of other Chinese companies to get off of U.S. origin technology. Not only Chinese companies to get off U.S. origin technology, but third-party countries, neutral countries as well, because if you're one of our big Korean competitors, and you can tell your Chinese customers that you've got products they can buy that the U.S. government cannot shut the spigot off on, that is a big selling point. So yes, effective remedy today, but what the long-term effects are much more hard to answer. And if you put yourself in the perspective of a Chinese company and say tomorrow magically the trade wars are all resolved, how many years of peace would you need before you make yourself reliant on U.S. technology again?
And I would just like to add that we are talking about technology, but given the ongoing trade dispute between US and China, while it may be difficult to find other countries willing to trade, once you lose that market, to be able to get that market back may also be difficult. For instance, China is looking at other countries in Asia and Latin America for farm products that were originally being exported from US to China. So what would happen in the future, assuming even if things were to go back to normal, will US be able to get those markets back? And that remains to be seen. We have time for one more question here for the panelists, and then we'll open it up for question and answer session from the audience. Steve raised the issue of the Belton Road initiative, so I was hoping we could get back to it. If you could sort of shed some light on what is it exactly, how many countries around the world does it affect, and how is China using it to expand its influence overseas? Additionally, how does it compare to its use of technology to exert its influence?
Yeah, I'm sure Irene has done additional work on that, so I'll just be brief. But essentially, it's an initiative where the sort of Chinese state works with different companies to provide incentives for those companies in the economic sphere, in particular, to access Chinese products. And so that can be in the form of soft loans, but that are specifically designed so that only Chinese firms are able to bid on certain types of products that those loans would then support. It's providing everything from hard infrastructure, so investing and funding for ports, for roads, for railways. You see it from high-speed railways in places like Ethiopia and Kenya that were sort of funded under the broader rubric of Belt and Road Initiative. But it's, you know, it's a way, it's a mixture of kind of economic incentives, investments that many of which are actually very much needed in places to improve their infrastructure. And then now it's also expanded through what they call the Digital Silk Road, kind of a loose term, into providing kind of ICT infrastructure. So the backbones to allow you know, greater internet connectivity, providing, you know, 5G would be sort of part of that as well. So it's really kind of pretty all-encompassing, and it extends to, I don't know how many countries are either officially or unofficially part of it, but let's say, you know, close to 100 plus. So really worldwide and a pretty big manifestation of Chinese economic expansion outward.
Yeah, sure. So the Belt and Road Initiative has also been called the New Silk Road because it really harkens back to the original Silk Road, which connected Europe to Asia centuries ago for the purpose of trades, right? Also from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so Xi Jinping announced both the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road in 2013. So these are infrastructure development and investment initiatives, as Steve mentioned, that would stretch from East Asia to Europe. So once again, this falls within Xi Jinping's vision, right, of replacing Western dominance, or even not just the U.S., but also U.S. allies' dominance, countries like Japan, for instance, and countries of the European Union that have been dominant in these other these parts of the world. And so in 2017, there were actually amendments introduced into the 19th CPC National Congress that introduced into the Constitution. And so one amendment to the Chinese Constitution was enshrining Xi Jinping's thought on socialism into the Constitution. And the second one is actually on the Belt and Road. So the Belt and Road Initiative is in China's Constitution as of 2017. And once again, I'll give the viewpoint from Southeast Asia because it is a key region for the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, especially the Maritime Silk Road, because it aims to connect China's coast to South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe through South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. Now, the thing is that even though the headlines have suggested a sunny outlook, right, that, oh, look, China's giving these countries a lot of money to build their infrastructure, you know, investing in these countries, the thing is that from what I've seen, and there are some surveys that have been conducted, that the reception of these countries to the Belt and Road Initiative has been mixed, in particular in Southeast Asia. On the one hand, a lot of countries around the world, including those in Southeast Asia, need money desperately to build infrastructure, but also they are wary of, you know, what are China's motives, right? Because the amount of money that are being invested in these countries are I think it's pretty staggering. So Indonesia is home to the highest investment, totaling 171 billion US dollars, followed by Vietnam, that's 152 billion, Cambodia 104 billion, Malaysia 98.5 billion, and it goes on. And so there are fears of debt traps, right? So if China's you know, putting a lot of money, loaning a lot of money into the building of infrastructure, what does that mean in terms of the ability of the countries you know, to pay China back? And so a survey was done in January of this year by Singapore's ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. And so they polled respondents from all 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, including people in government, academic, business community, civil society, and the media. And 73% of respondents believe that China now has the greatest economic influence and also believe to have more clout politically and strategically than the United States. And I think this is understandable given that the US is occupied with other things domestically at the moment and therefore has been missing from many parts of the world, including in Southeast Asia. However, around 70% said that governments should be cautious in negotiating the Belt and Road Initiative projects to avoid getting into unsustainable financial debts with China. And again, you know, Chinese investments and construction contracts have continued to expand. In Southeast Asia, it has nearly doubled to $11 billion in the first half of 2019 alone, from $5.6 billion in the second half of last year. So with all this said, I think there's a role to play by the US, the European Union, and Japan to counter China. So Japan is still the biggest donor in Asia, for instance, and still the largest lender to projects in Southeast Asia. So in terms of moving forward, right, if we're looking to counter Chinese influence, Chinese money, the influx of Chinese investments in countries around the world, I think that one thing that the US could possibly do is to work in concert with countries like Japan, with the European Union, countries that are democracies, in terms of providing these types of investments to avoid more countries around the world being pulled into China's orbit.
And just to give you an example of what Irene was just talking about, Sri Lanka could not pay back its loan to China, so they leased one of the ports in Sri Lanka for 100 years. And that gives you the magnitude of influence that China is going to be having in over South Asia, at least, for a very, very long time to come. Okay, well, thank you, panelists. With that, we'll take some questions. I think there's a mic on in this side of the room. We can take 2 questions at a time, and if you do have a question, I will request you to walk on over to the mic and also identify the person the question is posed to. And we'd love to hear from some students, so I would encourage students especially to take advantage of the panelists here if they have any questions.
Well, I'm not a student. Is that working? Hello? Yeah, okay. I wish I were a student, but you've talked about the success of China, and I find myself reflecting on almost 50 years ago, you discussed the opening to China and Nixon. The Cold War ends because the Soviet system is a failure. How is it that this autocratic Orwellian China is able to compete? Because we're supposed to be, free markets and democracies innovate, right? So in the long run, does this all collapse, or is the economics that we've been taught wrong? And is anyone in the field of economics talking about this and exploring, can a long-term, innovative, autocratic, Orwellian economy succeed?
So would you like to identify who the question is posed to? Just, okay.
I particularly would like to hear from the Micron guy.
Oh.
Yeah, I was so close to getting through this panel without giving this answer. I have no idea. I really don't have a good answer to that. I do think that it is different from the Soviet experience. It does seem to be more sustainable. I think if you look at the growth rates in China, they have been strong and sustainable even through the 2008 financial crisis. They still grew at close to double-digit rates when the rest of the world was suffering. I think they are transitioning away from an export-only economy to something more balanced. The big unknown is how strong is the political structure if and when they do hit a major downturn. How resilient is the political force, and I don't know.
I can try to take a crack at that question. I think the question that you asked, I think it is precisely the question that bedevils economists and political scientists. There used to be, I guess, more of a belief in the literature that, if you give them economic development, they're eventually democratized, right? But with the rise of China, I think that literature has been discredited. I think it just goes to show that the Chinese method of being very protective of its I mean, I guess everything. Like it's politically, economically, right, including using, for lack of a better term, heavy-handed censorship, right? It's all in the purpose of helping domestic companies succeed. It's all in the service of helping to maintain political stability at home. You know, that's why the Chinese government would censor any discussions about democracy or about the Tiananmen Square incident, right? And now, obviously, with the things that are going on in Hong Kong. However, as David pointed out, the true test would be what happens when growth slows in China, and this is where investments come in. So this is all interlinked, right? So if growth slows down at home, that means that Chinese companies, Chinese industries have to expand. And how do you do that, right? You have the state as the backing behind companies, because in China, all the big companies have party committees. So Sina Weibo, which is China's Twitter, has a party committee sitting as part of the business structure, essentially. And they are not only in charge of deciding which content to censor, but they also instruct the business, what do you call it, the employees to study Xi Jinping's teaching, right? So it's impossible to separate government and business in China because the two are so interlinked, right? But it is precisely, I think, what they see as the key to sustaining China's growth, that business and government need to work closely together. From their point of view, they might argue that, well, it's not different from what South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, right, the Asian tigers, it's not different than what they did in the past, where government were fully supporting businesses to thrive, right? And I think it's only by ensuring that the Chinese economy continue to grow. I mean, I heard that Costco is now in China. Like, what, right? So it's by ensuring that the Chinese citizens have access to the luxuries that we have in the West, while the government still trying to maintain this delicate balance of control to prevent a lot of resistance. That's probably the only way that they can sustain themselves, but how far and how long, and what are the implications? I think we're still struggling with these questions.
Thank you. We'll take the next two questions, yes.
I'm hoping I didn't miss this during your discussion, but I'm curious as to what effect, if any, the United States rejection of... No.
Seems to be an ongoing problem with the mics.
I'm wondering what the effect, if any, of the United States rejection of TPP might have or have had on the whole panoply of issues that you are now discussing. And it's for anybody who feels qualified to answer, which is probably all of you.
And we'll take the next question too. Okay.
Hello, I'm Mason from Boise High. And this is a question for anyone too. I was hoping if anyone could speak to American influence in the realm of social media in the Southeast Asia, specifically Facebook and its controversies in Myanmar right now.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So you want me to talk about the Facebook controversy in Myanmar?
Kind of like American responsibilities in representing kind of different parts of the world.
Okay.
Okay, so we have, the first question is about TPP and the effect that US sort of bailing out of TPP may have had on ongoing economic strained relations between US and China. And the second question is about Facebook and what's happening in Myanmar currently with the Rohingya refugees having to flee Myanmar and moving to Bangladesh. So whoever would like to address either of the two questions in any order.
All right, 1 point TPP, but David's really the expert feeling the effects on the ground, which is why I love having him, both David and Irene on the panel. I can just pawn off all the tough questions. TPP, you know, one thing I would say about that, I mean, I think certainly it was a huge mistake and really goes against our policy objectives to have left TPP. So I was in Taiwan last year at a conference, and it was about this kind of new idea that the U.S. is promoting, like a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And so the idea was there that we're not leaving the United States, that we're still here, we're working with our partner countries in Southeast Asia and so forth to counterbalance against China. And then the question everyone wanted to know, these were government representatives, private sector, and so forth. Well, you say that you're here to push and maintain U.S. Influence economically and politically in the region, and yet the biggest initiative that we could have used to help form a bloc that was an alternative to China is something you've walked away from. So how do you explain that? And I think the answer is you really can't. It's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. If one believes that the United States needs to take seriously China's rise, and that coming up with economic alternatives is something in our national security interests, which I do, then walking away from something that was meticulously negotiated without even trying to find a middle ground really goes against our own interests. And it's not something that I think works for us in the long run. And I hope that at some point, if we do think this is an area of strategic concern, that we find a way to get back to TPP.
And if I may just add to that, TPP, some of the provisions there included improving labor conditions, human rights conditions for countries overseas. So if we want to think like global citizens, that would be a pact that several countries around the world would try and promote. And just to reiterate Steve's point, I mean, yes, there were provisions that certain groups within the US took issues with, but there is always room for compromise. So I wish we had found a way to find that room for compromise, because there was a lot in there to applaud as well. Thank you. The second question regarding Myanmar.
Sure. I mean, that's a tough question, right? Like America's responsibility, given that Facebook is an American company and Facebook is implicated in the genocide against the Rohingya community in Myanmar. I think that is the question that I think all regulators are trying to grapple with. Facebook at the time, I think, they acknowledged that at the time the massacre was occurring, they had, in the entire company, they had 4 people who spoke the language, the Burmese language. And the Burmese language was predominantly where the hate speech against the Rohingya community that was used, right? It was predominantly in the Burmese language. So once again, this goes to show the challenges of global companies, of American companies or any other companies operating globally, in which they must understand the local context, right? I don't know, like the points of conflagration, right? Like what are the kinds of speech that could, in Myanmar's case, encourage massacres against one ethnic group, one religious group. And so I think Facebook is not unique in terms of facing this issue. I mean, certainly Google and Twitter and other social media platforms have to contend with this problem as well. And we don't even have to go so far to Myanmar. I mean, in Canada, because of the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, it did an investigation on Facebook and then found that Facebook violated like even its own terms of service, right, in terms of allowing third-party access to Facebook data, and demanded accountability from Facebook, and their answer was no thanks, right? Do you even have authority over us? We're an American company, and therefore we don't have to abide by whatever you say. And I think the case is about to go federal, and even if the claim is successful, the Canadian federal court, at the federal court, the Canadian privacy law provides little in the way of penalties. I think the newly established maximum is $100,000. I mean, for Facebook, that's like nothing, right? That's like a quarter for them. In contrast, Facebook said that it has set aside $3 billion in anticipation of U.S. enforcement penalties that could hit $5 billion, right? So so I guess there are a lot of questions there, right? On the private sector side, how much do we want to delegate responsibility to moderate content, to understand local context, to take down offending content, right? Are social media platforms expected to be I don't know, for lack of a better term, judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to negative content, right? However, that negative content is defined by, hundreds of jurisdictions around the world. And at the same time, as regulators, what can they do when it's a behemoth? Facebook is a huge company. What are the tools that are in place for regulators to sanction them as appropriate and to ensure that they have transparency and accountability into how they operate, given the potential ramifications?
Thank you.
It also just raises a question, too. That assumes the government itself is a benign actor, like Canada's government. If you look at a place like the Philippines, where the state is actively involved in disinformation, who's to say that whatever the Philippines state or government requests from Facebook is actually something that is benign versus something that sees to its own specific interests? And that's where so much of the danger lies on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, I think.
Thank you. We'll take the next 3 questions.
So this question is for either Mr. Ashmore or Mr. Feldstein. I'm not quite sure which one of you is more qualified to answer it. But if the trade embargoes were to go away with China, between China and America tomorrow, how would having Chinese companies on the enemies list and affect our trade with China? Like, would they come back, or is that not even factored into the trade discussion?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go. It's a good question. If you think about it from the perspective of a Chinese company who had been on the entities list and is removed from the entities list, are you going to go back to business as usual? It's your calculation of whether or not the peace is really long lasting, or whether or not you're still at risk of having your supply cut off again. So how much do you believe that it's really the world has changed? And as Nisha mentioned earlier, once you have moved your supply chain or your customer base out of the targeted region, and there's no compelling economic reason to move it back, it's kind of moved, and it's going to stay that way, or at least it's going to be the inertial forces will lead it to be different. For example, Micron had, as part of one of the early rounds of the Trump tariffs, as I mentioned before, we do manufacture some of our products in China, and it's a very detailed process to look at which products are covered by the tariffs. There's these tariff registers you have to go and compare, and lo and behold, we did have some products that were covered by tariffs that we were able to move the assembly work that had been done in Xi'an to Mexico. If those tariffs went away tomorrow, there's no economic reason why we'd move them back, that particular set of products back to China. They have moved, and I think, I'm no expert on the products themselves, but I think there'd be no reason to move them back. So I think, as your question is a good one, I think the long-term impacts of the trade dispute, even if magically resolved, are going to be felt for a while.
Okay, thank you. Let's take the next 3 questions, one after another. Yeah.
All right, I just have a simple question for Mr. Feldstein. For my own curiosity, I was just wondering do you think China needs us more than we need them?
Okay.
My question has more to do with the fact that China forever ago had another issue with censorship, where they basically got rid of the American character Winnie the Pooh, and they're capable of doing things like that, but with more examples such as video game characters being turned into examples of this, and lots of memes coming out around that sort of thing. Are they going to be able to censor every example that comes out, or will that eventually have to stop?
Okay.
So with the rising friction between different political and social groups in America, do you think America's close to enforcing their own citizen point system, and how do you think that would look like?
I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you repeat that question again, please?
Sure. So with the rising tension between different political and social groups in America, do you think America's close to enforcing their own citizen point system, going back to that China thing? And how do you think that would look like here?
Okay.
U.S. social credit system.
Yeah. Okay, so first question is for Steve. Do you think China needs us more than we need China? Second question, how much can China censor? And third question was, do we see something like a social credit system in the United States, like we talked about in the case of China? Okay, so Steve, if you want to start.
No, it's a fun question. Who needs the other more? I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I think part of what we've been describing is the fact that we have interrelated our economies so significantly that we're very reliant in terms of frankly on cheap Chinese products that allow us to have greater purchasing power than we otherwise would enjoy. And there are many component parts in advanced sort of manufacturing that even to this day, looking at Micron in particular, China is unable to manufacture. So without having that U.S. technology and prowess, they would be unable to manufacture and have certain types of things. So it has been a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that to me is sort of hits the bigger point, is that I don't think that either one of us would do very well from having a sort of complete separation. I don't really think that's feasible. And frankly, I don't think it's good for either one of our interests to do so. We need to find a way to coexist and set rules that are mutually enforceable. And I think that is the challenge to where we are. I think going into a new Cold War where we have total separation, different internets, different kind of technology standards doesn't augur well for the global economy. But how we get back to something that resembles more of a restoration of normality is harder and harder to see by the day.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, second question.
Okay, so I'll tackle the second question regarding China's desire to censor everything. I recommend reading a book by Margaret Roberts called Censored. So in that book, she conducted an interview with someone who used to head Chinese cyberspace administration. So he's literally the guy who used to be in charge of censoring the internet in China. And in that interview, I believe he said something like, we do realize that we can't possibly censor everything, right? China has 1 billion population, and increasingly a percentage of that population is going online and producing content online. So in terms of just the feasibility of censoring everything, they can't do that. So they have to be really strategic in terms of what they do censor and what do they let go. And so you mentioned the example of Winnie the Pooh, right? So Winnie the Pooh was censored because people were using Winnie the Pooh as I think it's called I can't remember what it's called, not a homonym, but like a stand-in. Yeah, like a stand-in for Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping kind of looks like Winnie the Pooh. So okay, I didn't say that, but according to the Chinese netizens think that, okay, like there are similarities. So aside from using images, they would also use Chinese words that sound similar to like a different word. I can't think of an example at the moment, but it's something like the word for bunny is the same for, I don't know, something like democracy. It's not, but that's just like an example. So they would use play on words to try and evade the censors is the point. And secondly, they would use images to try and evade the censor. So these are the two tactics that the Chinese netizens would use to get over censorship in China. And actually, where I work, the Citizen Lab, we've released a number of reports on this, documenting how, for instance, WeChat filters. So WeChat is like a chat platform like WhatsApp. So WeChat, how they filter images. We've also looked at, so we did a technical investigation on how exactly they do this, right? So the way it works is they maintain, I mean, it's going to get a bit technical, but essentially they use, I guess like MD5 like hashes, so to try to match images that they have in their database with the images that are posted on WeChat, and so they use algorithms essentially. So one is an optical character recognition OCR-based approach that filters images containing sensitive text, and a visual-based one that filters images that are visually similar to those on an image blacklist. So they try to match the two, and if it matches enough, right, a significant percentage, then that image gets filtered out. But again, the system is not, it's not flawless, right? Like, especially given the amount of content that is generated, but they're trying their best. And censorship is only one. They certainly use fear as a tactic. So by arresting people, torturing them, to set an example that you are not supposed to post this kind of content, and they also do use a tactic called flooding, which is they flood information on the internet as much as possible, so that it becomes more difficult for the users to find out the correct information versus the the state fed like propaganda information. And the research has shown that for the average user, that alone is enough to deter them from wanting to seek more information, right? It's by fear, friction is censorship, and flooding. So if you read Margaret Roberts' book, Censored, she details these tactics, but in short, like I said, it's not a flawless system. It's something that they have to manage. And to David's point earlier about, what happens when society becomes more aware, more developed, are they going to demand democracy, right? The Chinese government has shown some sort of responsiveness. So when people protest, let's say about pollution or something like that, they try to show that they care about it and they try to do something about it. But then, where's that threshold, right? When they then clamp it down, they censor, they flood, etc.
I'll take the last question. I remember it. So this is a question about whether or not the U.S. would impose is at risk of imposing a social credit system. As long as there's a functioning Supreme Court, topic for another panel, it's never going to happen. Wildly unconstitutional.
We have time for last two questions. I'm sorry for the others. Please feel free to approach the panelists if they are willing to hang around after the panel discussion. Go ahead.
My question is primarily for the two researchers in the center. You mentioned that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its member states had endorsed China's position regarding censorship and cybersecurity. Given that India joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2017, I'm curious as to whether they have bandwagoned with the Chinese position or whether India has taken a different path.
So my question is for whoever feels most qualified to answer it. But I was just wondering, so because China is becoming more independent and they're not having to import as many things, and they're going to start exporting more. So with that, how is that going to affect the U.S. on a personal level or even on an economic level?
Okay, thank you. I think, Irene, you want to take the first question.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually what I'm writing my PhD dissertation about, so we can chat after. And so I think it remains to be seen, right? Because as you said, India recently joined. And so in my research, oh, sorry. Sure. Sorry about that. In terms of the I guess like the future prognosis of how India and I would think other countries, even though they haven't signed on to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but they are what have been referred to as swing states in terms of the global internet debates, right? So they are not the US or Western liberal democracies, but they're not China, Russia, or former Soviet states either. They're somewhere in between, and India is certainly one of them. It still remains to be seen what happens in the future, especially once again, as this conference is called the Age of Anxiety, right? I think every government in the world is anxious over the state of their governments, right? They are all fearful of the impact of fake news, of rumors and hoaxes, and India being, a humongous population, and a lot of them are coming online for the first time. How they use the internet, what do they use it for, etc., and whether they fall prey to these rumors. I think the Indian government has conducted internet shutdowns precisely to curb rumors because they have caused. Sorry.
Most in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Most in the world, as Stephen said, because they are concerned over the negative impact of technology. I think is a huge concern, and I could see why they would find the notion of cybersecurity that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like China and Russia, advocate, which is information security, the concern over content. I think it's easy to see why countries like India and others who are dealing with a lot of these issues find them appealing, right? So stay tuned, I guess, is the answer.
Thank you, Irene. And then the last question, if I remember correctly, is about US-China relations moving forward and what they will look like.
That sounds like a good question for David to kick off.
Okay, let me shamelessly hijack that question and see if we can leave our students with a few questions to solve. One, is a level playing field an important policy goal, or should it be? 2, is there an unfair playing field today? Hopefully I've left you with the impression that there is, at least in semiconductors. 3, are tariffs an effective way of trying to achieve a level playing field? 4, is there another way than tariffs? And 5, are the costs associated with tariffs or export control worth trying to get a level playing field?
Thank you, David. Well, thank you once again to all my panelists here and for everyone to sit through this panel discussion and ask very insightful questions. Thank you. I hope you have a great day.
We're going to take a 10-minute break and reconvene the next panel promptly at 10:45.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Stellar. Thank you. Meeting now. All your great moderating questions. Yeah, not an easy topic. Lots of things.
That was great.
Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and we'll get the next panel started.
An extra piece of paper I could use.
Please take your seats.
No. I'll ask Chase, I guess. A piece of paper I could use? Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to welcome you to the second panel.
Okay, thanks.
Titled Threats from Russia, Challenges from Populism. My name's Greg Raymond. I'll be the moderator of this panel. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to frame our discussion by highlighting three worrisome trends. The first trend is that democracy is in decline. Freedom House, an organization that conducts annual surveys on the state of democracy worldwide, has recorded 13 straight years of decline in freedom around the world. Vladimir Putin thinks he knows why. In a recent interview that he gave with the Financial Times, he said that liberal democracy was obsolete. Political humor in Moscow captures that mood. A story is often told that after an election, an aide came into Putin's office and said, "I've got good news and I've got bad news." Putin said, "Well, I'm not afraid of anything. I know judo. I wrestle bears. I chase tigers. Tell me the bad news." And the aide said, "Well, your opponent won 51% of the vote in the election." Putin said, "Oh no, how could that be? This is terrible. What possibly could be the good news?" And the aide said, "But you won 62% of the vote." Illiberal regimes, such as Putin's Russia, used to masquerade as open societies. In today's environment, they have dropped the pretense. The second trend that I think is worrisome is as democracies have declined, authoritarian populism has gone up. There are more anti-pluralist leaders around that claim to embody the will of the common man and have built bases of support based on nativist appeals. A third worrisome trend is that there has been a massive expansion of disinformation campaigns aimed at sowing distrust toward democratic rules and institutions. A recent study conducted by researchers at Oxford University found that today 70 countries are involved in organized social media manipulation. That's a 150% increase in just 2 years. Most of those campaigns are aimed at domestic audiences. 71% of the messages were to spread pro-government propaganda. 89% were to smear domestic opponents. 34% were to drive wedges among different groups within society. Of those 70 countries, 56 of them are very active on Facebook and Twitter. And of those 56 countries, 9 have very complex, elaborate staffs that are engaged in these disinformation campaigns. 5 of the countries are heavily involved using social media to engage in foreign influence. One of the most prominent is Russia. Russia has a long tradition of disinformation. At the turn of the 19th century, the Tsarist secret police forged a document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was an elaborate conspiracy theory aimed to target the Jewish population within Russia. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union conducted over 10,000 disinformation operations that at their peak involved 15,000 personnel. Perhaps the most famous occurred during the time of Yuri Andropov, when the Russians came up with a plan to suggest that AIDS was the result of biological weapons manufactured in the United States that had gone awry. Over the last 5 years, the Internet Research Agency, based in St. Petersburg, has been involved in over 61,000 posts on Facebook, 116,000 posts on Instagram, and over 10.4 million tweets, all designed to sow confusion and drive wedges among different groups within democratic societies. To help us make some sense out of these worrisome trends and the anxiety that democratic citizens are going through these days, we have two established panelists who bring a wealth of expertise to the topic. On my left is Rob Burzynski. He's a senior vice president for policy at Human Rights First, a nonpartisan organization based in New York City that focuses on human rights. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which was responsible for implementing U.S. policies with respect to democracy in 65 countries across Europe, Russia, and Asia. He also served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Mission of the United Nations Office in Washington, D.C., and as Special Assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense and Director for Security and Human Rights Policy at the White House National Security Council. He's a graduate of Yale University, an Iraq War veteran, and a former intelligence officer in the Air Force. He's published widely on human rights and American foreign policy, including work that has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, Vanity Fair, and elsewhere. To my right is James Churchill. He's a visiting fellow in the Center for the United States in Europe and the Project of International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution, where he researches and reports on American foreign policy, transatlantic relations, European politics, and grand strategy. James is a widely respected journalist who has published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, the Weekly Standard, the Spectator of London, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, as well as in other locations. He too is a graduate of Yale University. He began his professional journalism career with the New Republic and later moved to Prague, where he became a writer at large for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. He's been a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow, a Hoover Institution Fellow, and a Phillips Foundation Fellow. A leading voice on international gay rights, he's been the recipient of the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association Journalist of the Year Award. He's also written a book titled The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, which was published by Yale University Press. As in the previous panel, we will begin by posing questions to our panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. Let me begin by asking a generic question to both of our panelists. How do you size up the current situation? There's an old Russian joke that says, what's the difference between a Russian optimist and a Russian pessimist? A Russian pessimist says, things are so bad, they can't get any worse. And a Russian optimist says, oh yes they can. So let me turn to the panelists and ask, how bad are things? Can they get worse? What worries you the most? Let me turn to Rob first.
All right, thank you, Dr. Raymond. I'm in favor of just foregoing my introductory here and just leaving the floor to Dr. Raymond for more stand-up comedy. show of hands, yeah. All right. It's great to be with you, and my thanks to the Frank Church Institute for having me. It's certainly safe to say, as we heard from Boise's mayor this morning, that the Institute could not have landed on a more timely and compelling theme for this year's conference. And just given what's in the news right this week, it's hard to know where to begin. One good place is to start by stipulating that for the purposes of this panel, we're dealing with two discrete issues that are interwoven in certain ways, but are otherwise separate, right? So think of a Venn diagram, two circles. One is threats from Russia, one is the rise of populism. There's definitely an overlap in the middle, but certainly many areas in which the two don't intersect. That said, I want to start in that middle area with two matters that came to light just within the past couple of weeks within the United States. The first is that the Republican-controlled Senate Select Committee on Intelligence released the second volume of its report detailing the extent to which Russian operatives conducted an information warfare campaign in the United States with the intention of influencing the 2016 presidential election and widening American societal divisions. Much of what that bipartisan report said is already pretty well known to those that follow these issues closely, but there are a few points worth highlighting. One is that Russian operatives at the so-called Internet Research Agency, what Greg mentioned, or IRA, working at the express direction of the Kremlin, conducted, quote, a vastly more complex and strategic assault on the United States than was initially understood. The second is that, quote, the preponderance of operational focus was on socially divisive issues such as race, immigration, and Second Amendment rights in order to stoke anger, provoke outrage and protest, push Americans further away from one another, and grow distrust in government institutions. And finally, as Greg also highlighted, rather than ceasing activity after the 2016 election, IRA activity online actually increased across every major social media outlet, including not just Facebook and Twitter, which got a lot of the press in the immediate aftermath of the election, but also platforms like Instagram and YouTube. The second piece of news was the indictment announced just last Thursday of two American citizens, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, who were born in Ukraine and Belarus, respectively, who stand accused by the Department of Justice of violating campaign finance laws by funneling money through a shell company to curry political favors, including the then US ambassador to Ukraine, and separately of secretly conspiring with a Russian national to funnel illegal Russian campaign contributions to US politicians. So what do these two pieces of information tell us? I'd suggest that they're relevant to this morning's conversation in at least two ways. First is that Russian interference in the internal politics of democracies is both national level policy and somewhat opportunistic, and it isn't going away anytime soon. And second, the policy is based on a twofold strategy of one, exacerbating social cleavages and narratives that are often at the center of populist appeals, issues like race and immigration, as I mentioned, for instance. And two, assisting politicians and political parties that support policies favorable to Moscow, principally issues like sanctions relief, a weakened European Union and NATO, a permissive approach toward Vladimir Putin's kleptocracy and repression at home, and foreign policies abroad. Again, policies that are generally, not always, but generally supported by populist and far-right parties. Now, I obviously focus these two anecdotes on events within the United States, but similar events have unfolded in a variety of European countries in recent years, from Russian propaganda deployed in support of populist parties in countries like France and Hungary, to the recent collapse of the Austrian government due to the leader of its far-right Freedom Party being caught discussing a corrupt scheme with someone he believed was linked to a Russian oligarch. Coming back to that Venn diagram, Russia isn't, of course, causing the rise of nativist, nationalist, and populist voices in Europe and the United States, much less anywhere else in the world in countries from the Philippines to Brazil and beyond. Some scholars of populism define the term as an ideology built around distinguishing between a real or pure people on the one hand and some other outgroup on the other, be that elites or globalists or Jews or Muslims or migrants. Populists tend to talk in the language of being one with that real people against the elite and needing to operate independent of laws, rules, and institutions is what they describe as an inherently unjust or corrupt system. So what follows are attacks on democratic guardrails meant to constrain the unilateral power and protect political, ethnic, and religious minorities, as well as institutions like the media, courts, NGOs, and career government officials. Leaders that espouse these views would likely be ascendant relative to pick one time period, the 1990s, for a multitude of reasons that have little to do with Russia. The backlash against increased global migration, economic inequality, the transformed media environment and the role of rapid technological change, and a sense that mainstream political parties and supranational organizations like the European Union just simply aren't delivering for their citizenry. Yet there's also no debate at this point about the extent to which Russia supports populist and far-right voices in countries across Europe as one of many actions aimed at expanding its influence. It's doing this through online disinformation and the wielding of illicit financial flows, by weaponizing corruption and maximizing leverage with key sectors like gas and nuclear energy, and by promulgating pro-Russia policies through a web of ostensibly independent civic organizations and even the Orthodox Church. The good news on this front is that there's significantly more recognition of Russia's activities than even a couple of years ago. The less good news is that there doesn't always appear to be any consensus or political will on how about the confronting of these malign activities. Finding appropriate responses to the populist challenge is in many respects orders of magnitude more complex than confronting Russia, given that populist leaders are tapping into very complex societal concerns related to national identity and economic security. So there's certainly plenty to discuss on the panel, given a widespread sense that the structural drivers that give life to populists and demagogues aren't going away anytime soon. Thanks.
Thank you. James, what worries you as you look out at the horizon, the diplomatic horizon?
I'm very worried that increasingly people in the West are living in different realities and they're inhabiting different silos. We get our news from different sources. We completely don't trust those on the other side. We've come to demonize people within our own societies and countries who happen to have political disagreements as being mortal enemies. I see the language that is now being used on both sides in this country. I mean, we have, the president and his supporters calling the head of the Intelligence Committee a traitor who should be arrested. But on the other hand, we have many Democrats who refer to the president as a traitor as well. And this kind of language is really, really poisonous. And I see it in Britain. We see it now over Brexit and the way that the popular press is referring to members of the judiciary as enemies of the people for deciding, against those who wanted to push through with Brexit. But on the other hand, you also have people who are opposed to Brexit calling those who support Brexit, Russian stooges and whatnot. So this sort of rhetoric that we're using, I think, is really unfortunate. And I think it's connected to the Venn diagram that Rob mentioned, which I think is very important to understand these two issues because they are discrete, and it's very important to realize that. And I think since 2016, a lot of people would like to frankly conflate them, by which I mean and I put myself in this category, those of us who are sort of, cosmopolitan, small L liberals who live in metropolitan areas and did not vote for Donald Trump, would like to believe that the only reason why Donald Trump became president, or the main reason why he became president, is because of Russian interference. And there are many people in this country who genuinely, seriously still believe this. And I did for a while too, until I started talking to more people who voted for President Trump, and I realized that was a very simplistic understanding. But it's the same with Brexit. You talk to many people in London, and the only way that they can fathom that Brexit was able to pass is because of these sort of, very rural, uneducated people in the northern part of the country who were just sort of fed a bunch of propaganda from Russian bots. And this is a very comforting way to understand things, but I really think it's not true. I think it's possible to believe that two things are true at the same time, that Russia is doing everything that Rob said, that they are investing heavily in disinformation, that they are hacking the Democratic Party, hacking Hillary Clinton's campaign, disseminating that information through WikiLeaks. They were doing it in 2016 to support certain political candidates, and I use that plural because many people forget this, but the first beneficiary of Russian disinformation in 2016 was not Donald Trump, it was Bernie Sanders. If you'll recall, in the summer of 2016, on the eve of the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks dumped a bunch of correspondence from within the Democratic Party purporting to show that the Democratic Party was favoring Hillary Clinton over Bernie. This led to outrage from Bernie supporters, and in fact, it led to the resignation of the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, just the day before this all began. That was all designed to hurt Hillary Clinton and to help Bernie Sanders. And so I think people need to understand that this Russian disinformation is it's not meant to help, one particular party or side. It is meant to confuse and sow chaos and distrust within our societies. And it just so happens that in 2016, for various reasons that we can get into, the foreign policies that were supported by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were more favorable to the Russians than what Hillary Clinton did. So they were willing to basically support both candidates on the left and the right. And you see this throughout Europe, my area of concern. It's not just the far right who the Russians are supporting, although it's mostly the far right, but there's also a lot of far left political forces as well. And then often it's often easier to think of politics not as a spectrum on a line, but really as a horseshoe. And the far right and the far left often have more in common than they would either like to think. So I think that's very important that we understand this, because over the past 3 or 4 years, a whole sort of industry has grown regarding sort of, fighting disinformation and fighting Russian influence. And this is very important, but I think it often overlooks the fact that there are very real, serious concerns that people have in Western societies that they feel are not being addressed by mainstream political forces. And so what do? They vote for these populist parties. And the Russians are sort of, they're kind of putting salt in the soup. They're supporting it, they're encouraging it, they're fomenting it, absolutely. But I don't think that we should think that, absent, let's just say Russia didn't exist. Let's say Russia, or let's say Russia was a perfectly normal liberal democracy that didn't interfere in other countries' domestic politics. We would still have these problems. And I'll look at one issue in particular, which I think illustrates this. If you look at the issue of immigration, particularly in Europe, for quite a long time until recently, there was pretty much a bipartisan consensus. I don't even know if that's the word I would use, but there was really not much difference between center-right and center-left parties on the issue of immigration. And if you look at a country like Sweden, for instance, where basically every major political party supported massive immigration, okay, large numbers of largely unskilled immigrants. And this led to a situation where you had about 45 to 48% of the Swedish electorate wanted massive decreases in immigration. But for a variety of reasons, the mainstream political parties were frankly not listening to this. And then you have the 2015 immigration crisis. And this leads to the rise of far-right parties across the European continent. I would argue it's the reason why Brexit succeeded the following summer. You could even argue that it helped Donald Trump become president of the United States, because a lot of Americans were looking at Europe and seeing, hordes of people coming into Europe. And what was Donald Trump? He was getting up and saying, look at what they're doing. They don't have any control over their borders. That's going to happen if you vote for Hillary Clinton. I think that helped his campaign. And so in Sweden now you have a situation where the second largest political party in the country is a far-right party. Because when no one in the mainstream is willing to listen to voters, eventually a lot of those voters are going to vote for political parties that are frankly, and in my opinion, and most of the opinion of most of the people in this room, are frankly unsavory. And I think that's probably why Donald Trump got a lot of voters too, because a lot of people felt that they weren't being listened to. And so I think that while we should acknowledge what the Russians are doing, and we should acknowledge their malign influence, and we should expose it, we shouldn't do so at the cost of ignoring or sort of condemning people in our own societies who may have views on political issues that we happen to disagree with. I think this goes a long way, frankly, to explaining the whole Russiagate imbroglio, which basically, obsessed, at least where I live, Washington, D.C. I probably didn't obsess people here in Boise, Idaho, but it certainly obsessed Washington, D.C. for 2.5 years. And the Mueller report, kind of frankly, I think landed with a thud across most of the country, because there were a lot of people in Washington who were really hoping, believing that Donald Trump was going to be, put into handcuffs and escorted from the White House. And I think that, again, this kind of shows how out of touch many people are in Washington. I think it's possible to believe, as I was frankly saying from the beginning, that Donald Trump's views on Russia, the things that he said publicly about Russia, the associations that he's had with, or that people around him have had with Russia, they're disturbing enough, they're concerning enough that we didn't really need to create this, there's really no other word for it, a conspiracy. I mean, some people were saying that Donald Trump was recruited by the Soviet Union, by the KGB in 1987. And this was something that was taken seriously by many people in Washington. So it's strange, if you study a culture and a society like Russia, which is very conspiratorial, because in undemocratic societies, conspiracies are very easy to spread. And I see it happening here in the United States, where a lot of people are beginning to believe in conspiracy theories, not just people on the far right, not just people. I mean, one story I covered during the 2016 campaign was actually a local story here in Idaho with the Chobani yogurt factory in Twin Falls, which I know has been very welcoming to refugees. They work in the factory, and there was this whole kind of Breitbart-driven conspiracy that refugees and migrants were raping people across Twin Falls. It was a complete and utter hoax. But it's not just the far right that believes in conspiracy theories. I mean, if you tuned into MSNBC, at any point over the past 2.5 years, you would have seen these very Baroque. I mean, it would have reminded you of Glenn Beck during the Obama years. Remember, he had the whiteboard, and Obama was connected to Al-Qaeda and this and that and the Communist Party. I mean, it wasn't that much better on MSNBC and Donald Trump's various connections. So I think we need to kind of get out of this conspiratorial mindset. And if you ask me what am I worried about, I think the Russians have almost won in a way. If you look at the way Americans now are talking about each other and how we're talking about people who have different political views. Again, this isn't something that was created by the Russians. But if I was Vladimir Putin, I was looking in on American society, and I saw Democrats calling Republicans fascist, traitors and agents of a foreign power, and I saw Republicans calling, Democrats all the sorts of nasty names that they use. I'd be pretty happy about that if I was Vladimir Putin, because it makes it very difficult for us to act on the international stage when we're so at each other's throats. I think during the Cold War, obviously there were, massive divisions within American society, but there was a more singular purpose. I think it was easier to understand who our adversary was. It was the Soviet Union. It was Marxist-Leninist ideology. There was a literal iron curtain across the middle of Europe. It was much more easier to understand what we were up against. And now it's much more difficult, I think. It's much harder to explain to the American people, what is the great generational challenge of our era. It's just a much more complicated, sophisticated set of challenges.
Well, we have a lot to worry about. Let me focus first of all on the issue of disinformation and how widely conspiracy theories can travel and how fast they travel. A recent study was published in the journal Science, which tracked 125,000 news stories on Twitter, shared by more than 3 million people. And what they found was that false stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than those that are not false. True stories took 6 times longer to reach a threshold of 1,500 people than false stories. What accounts for this? Let me turn to Rob and say, what's happening? Why is disinformation seemingly so powerful today and able to spread false news so far and so quickly?
Well, it's a super important question. I think anybody that's spent any time online recognizes a few things, one of which is, with respect to social media, the more extreme the voice of the speaker, the more likely they are to receive feedback of any kind. And the model of our social media companies is commoditizing your information in order to sell to advertisers. Each social media company needs the most attention possible for the longest period of time to sell you advertising. What that business model lends itself to is the rise of the most extreme, sometimes more benevolent, funny, insightful, but often those that traffic in information that is egregious and false. And there is, at this point, as far as I can tell, no consensus out there on what we do about this problem. Coming from the human rights and civil liberties world, there is a very difficult and ongoing debate right now about how to protect freedom of expression in that environment. What I mean by that is freedom of expression purists have always abided by a mantra that's effectively, if everyone is allowed to speak, good speech drowns out bad. And I think there is a case at this point for that not being true over social media, given the statistics that you just mentioned, Greg. Given how important it is in an age of widespread and growing government censorship, much of what we heard about on the first panel, I am not going to stand here and say that the answer is censorship, but I think there's no agreement on what the appropriate answer is, even though we do know we're facing a major problem.
James, let me ask you to take your journalist's eye and focus on the problems that arise with new technology that allow someone to manipulate video and audio to create a deep fake. This is a video that would make it look like someone is saying something that they're not actually saying. Now, this is a problem, it seems to me, at least for 2 reasons. On the one hand, psychologists tell us that there is what could be called an anchoring trap that all human beings fall into. We give disproportionate influence to the first information we get. A second problem is what could be called the liar's advantage. That if I'm caught doing something, I, in a world of deep fakes, could say, well, no, I actually didn't say that. This was some type of disinformation conjured up somewhere else. So as a journalist, is the world going to be more difficult to do your job today, tomorrow, next week, next month, than it ever has been for journalists before?
I think so, and the prospect of deep fakes are really horrifying. If you look at, I don't know if people in the room are familiar with this, but you can look at online already, you can see sort of prototypes of this, where they've managed to, they take a video of former President Obama, for instance, and they use his voice, and they use animation, technology, whatnot, and machine learning, and they have him, saying crazy things. And it looks entirely real, and it sounds entirely real. And I don't think we're far from the point where, you could conceivably see situations where countries are almost led to major diplomatic imbroglios, if not, wars, right? You could have you could fake the leader of a country declaring war on another country, and it could lead to some very serious consequences. So unless we get a handle on this, unless there's some way to verify what it is people are saying, I think we're in for some very dangerous potential scenarios. And I haven't seen, again, I'm not an expert on the issue of deep fakes or the sort of technology, but I haven't seen anyone convincingly, show how they'll be prevented from convincing people. Because as we know, we live in times where people will retweet a fake story far more than they'll ever retweet the correction, if they'll ever even see the correction. So that's something I'm deeply worried about, and I think this is an area where the First Amendment might not necessarily apply, because it's might fall under the category of libel or slander. I'm not a First Amendment attorney. I do consider myself a purist, if you want to use that term, but I'm not sure that deep fakes would really necessarily fall under that. It would almost be like me, writing an article and then putting someone else's name on the byline is really what it is doing, and I don't think that, and then publishing it somewhere and trying to convince you all that my enemy wrote what I wrote instead. I think that's what the equivalent would be. So there probably, I'm sure there certainly is a legal remedy for deep fakes, but of course by the time the lawyers get involved, it may be too late to do anything.
Rob, Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, recently published a book called Information Wars. In it, he argues, we've already lost the global battle over disinformation. Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, has said that the State Department is being hollowed out. Are these pessimistic views, you think, accurate, or do they need a corrective?
You're asking me this at a conference entitled Democracy in the Age of Anxiety? No, I don't think they're pessimistic views. I can tell you that having recently served in the State Department, morale is quite low for a number of different reasons. There has been a concerted direction sent from the White House that plays down certainly U.S. diplomacy, but also expertise writ large, which is really the currency of the State Department. At the end of the day, the U.S. military in which I served has hardware. The State Department is really about software. It's about expertise and being able to engage with people that are coming from a different place than you are and reaching compromise. And you can't build that capability overnight. So in everything we've seen, from hiring freezes instituted such that new young people aren't coming in to the organization who will really reach the apogee of their own intellectual firepower years and decades down the road, to the resignations we're seeing of the mid and senior level officials who have benefited from those years and decades of experience. The hole in the middle of the State Department is pretty profound. Doesn't mean that the United States can't snap back, but I think we need to be realistic about the fact that what we're losing right now is going to play a role in relative U.S. power for decades to come.
James, you've written on dictators and demagogues. We've seen populists before. In the 1940s and 50s, we had Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, Juan Perón in Argentina. is there something different about the current generation of European populists than the populism we've seen before? How durable is this move of populism? Has it crested, or is it likely to continue to gain strength?
Well, one of the main drivers of populism in the 1930s in interwar Europe, obviously, was the economic collapse. That was a huge factor. Was the depression, the massive unemployment, which creates fertile ground for populists. And while the economic crash of 2008 and the ongoing massive changes that we're seeing in our economy with the future of work, I don't want to underplay these changes and how disruptive they are. Particularly if you look at something like, automatic or self-driving cars, which could potentially put out of business, anyone who drives a car for a living, or a truck, which is a huge means of employment, particularly for non-college educated men in the United States. I don't want to downplay how disruptive these economic changes are. I don't think that we are really anywhere close to the total and utter sort of economic dislocation, collapse that had occurred during the Great Depression in Europe. So while there are certainly many roots and drivers of populism right now, I think that we've already seen some positive indications that it could be beaten back. If you look at Greece, which was probably the most hardest hit by the economic crisis in Europe. They went through a pretty long spell of having a populist left-wing government, but their economy's doing better, and now they have a mainstream center-right party leading the country again. So that's one sort of glimmer of hope. But I don't think that the populists who are in power in Europe now, obviously there's similar tactics that they use to those who were in Europe, but I don't think we're really close to the point where we can make comparisons, or sort of, side-by-side comparisons between these populist leaders in Europe right now and what was happening in Europe in the 1930s.
There are two images that exist regarding how to interpret Vladimir Putin in Russia today. One image portrays Putin as an ambitious, opportunistic, authoritarian leader who is engaged in a campaign of cyber influence to try and weaken democracy and democratic institutions. There's a second image, however. It's a revisionist image. And it argues that Putin's actions are more defensive, more rooted in a sense of vulnerability and resentment over unfair treatment than anything else. Each of our panelists comes at the question of Russia from a different perspective, and I'd like to turn first to Rob and ask him how useful is this second image, this revisionist image? To what extent is Russian behavior a reaction by a vulnerable state to perceived unfair treatment, and to what extent is something like U.S. support for the color revolutions behind Russia's more aggressive posture today?
So I think the most honest answer is there are elements of both of those theories in play in terms of Russian behavior domestically and abroad. There's no doubt that, as has been widely reported, Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB officer at the end of the Cold War, saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe, and feels that Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence, and that it is an exceptional nation in the way that many Americans feel about American exceptionalism. It's also true that in the wake of the Cold War, the US government took a number of steps that Putin and other Russian leaders believe violated Russia's place in the world. So issues like NATO expansion, issues like support for Kosovar independence. Now, scholars and policymakers do not tire of arguing over both the kind of relative weight to give to those actions, whether they were right in the moment, what their unintended consequences were, and so on. But I would argue that none of that in any way should serve as an excuse for what we are seeing the Russian state under Putin's leadership undertake. He may believe that US support for pro-democracy movements around the world and in the Russian near abroad is justification for his government's meddling in the US presidential election and elections perhaps to come, for support for far-right and, as James correctly mentions, in some instances far-left parties within Europe, and so on and so forth. But I and most people I come in contact with would argue strenuously that there is a difference between promoting individual liberty and systems of governance that provide for a fair playing field on the one hand, and the covert and overt means by which Russia is working to undermine democracies. I think at the end of the day, what Vladimir Putin wants is a divided United States and a divided Europe that has less unity on major questions in terms of Russia's ability to maneuver both domestically and in terms of its foreign policy. That includes, to a massive extent, the corruption that Putin has engaged in and that his cronies have engaged in. And so at the end of the day, if the United States and various European countries are spending more of their time focused internally and less of their time confronting Russia for its actions, for instance, in annexing Crimea and invading eastern Ukraine, that works to Putin's advantage.
Let me, at this point, ask anyone in the audience who has questions to come up to the microphone. I believe we have a second microphone now, or perhaps not. But while you're coming up and formulating your questions, let me ask James one last question, and that is, how do we deter operations involving disinformation and cyber influence? Deterrence theory usually emphasizes either denial, trying to harden a target so that it's not worth someone's effort to attack it, or punishment, retaliating, and the threat of retaliation being such that no one would attack you. Is there any deterrent strategy, whether it be denial or punishment, that can work in the digital realm with cyber influence?
I think there are several. We can certainly use our own information that we have, and I'm not suggesting that we respond in kind to what the Russians are doing, but we certainly have embarrassing information on Vladimir Putin, how much money he's saved in various possibly Swiss bank accounts that he might not want being revealed publicly. I think we should be more aggressive in using that. There's also, frankly, exposure. I mean, you mentioned the AIDS conspiracy theory that was spread by the Soviets in the 1980s. I mean, we had a whole team at the State Department that was devoted to exposing these lies, traveling around the world to foreign embassies and sharing with local populations the way that these lies were being disseminated. I think we need to have a much more robust response mechanism in the United States. But the real, the best thing, the most effective thing that we need to do is, I think, media literacy. We need to have a populace that is educated and knows how to decipher, real news from fake news. And if you look at the countries that are in the Russian periphery, if you look at the Baltic states, if you look at Finland, these are peoples who have grown up from the very beginning for over 100 years. I mean, their entire existence has been living next to Russia and being the target of these information operations. Their populations are much more well-versed in being able to detect or just being sort of suspicious of these sorts of lies and conspiracies that the Russians are supporting. And it starts in grade school. It starts in educating youngsters in how to decipher information. And I don't think we do a very good job of that in this country.
Hey, let me turn to the audience now and take several questions in rapid succession, and we'll have the panelists respond. Okay.
Not a problem. I know what to do with microphones.
Yeah. This is an old Soviet microphone. This is the problem.
So speaking of democracy and anxiety, my biggest source of anxiety regarding our democracy is election security. I understand that recently there was bipartisan support for enacting policies and measures that would increase American election security. Again, there was bipartisan support, and yet Mitch McConnell did not, as I understand it, allow a vote to proceed on most, if not most or all of those. What do you think is going on, and what can we do to strengthen our election security?
Okay, second question.
If I may, I'll rather have two parts. So Mr. Burzynski rather touched on the issue of Putin's motivations. So again, what happens if he truly wins and liberal democracies are destroyed? I mean, is it all a matter of personal enrichment or that of his cronies? Does he really have an imperialistic idea going on? Are they trying to bury us from way back when? And that rather moves into, is Russia interfering in China at all? Or what then is truly the relation between the two countries? As we see the Belton Road Initiative has a little spur line off to Moscow, but they're certainly not trying to build and complete in Russia per se. And are the countries in conflict? Are they in cooperation? Or are they indifferent and working on their own points of view at this point? And I'll stop.
Okay, and one more.
This is a question that we covered in our AP class, but I want to get your guys' opinion on it. And let me find that.
Please get as close as you can to the microphone.
Do you believe that voter ID is going to prevent foreign interference in the elections, and is it worth the decrease in voter participation in our minorities that may not have enough documentation to acquire their voter ID?
Okay, thank you. There are three questions. Two of them dovetail. The first one on how do we strengthen election security, and then the third one on the use of voter IDs. And then the other question that was raised was, what are Putin's motives? Are they financial? Are they strategic? And what is the likelihood of rivalry between Russia and China? So I'll open it to anyone on the panel who wants to take a stab at either of those.
I'll take the question about Russian intentions. I think Vladimir Putin wants to basically achieve a Yalta II. If you remember the Yalta Agreement after World War II, the Second World War, was basically gave the Soviets, or allowed them to exert control over Central and Eastern Europe. And I think that the reason why we have problems with Vladimir Putin's Russia, and it's really more than him, it really is deeper than that. This is something that I think is unfortunately widely believed among the Russian public, which is that they've never come to terms with the end of the Cold War and the loss of their empire. And by that I mean that the end of the Cold War did not just mean the end of Marxist-Leninism as a doctrine and the failure of communism as a political doctrine. It more specifically meant the end of the Russian Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. And it meant that a certain idea of state sovereignty had won out over another, by which I mean that the notion that states have a right not to be invaded or occupied or controlled from afar, in this case Moscow, that vision of Europe had proven victorious over the Russian vision, which was basically that the Russians get to dictate who's president in which country, and we're going to control this, and we're going to have soldiers stationed there. And the Russians haven't come to terms with this. And so I'm not suggesting that the Russians want to, redeploy their soldiers into, Prague in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and basically reoccupy all the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. But they want to basically have freedom of movement. They basically want to be the hegemonic power in that part of the world. And I think this is something that we can't agree to. I mean, this is why we fought the Cold War for 45 years, was because we didn't believe that this was a fair or moral or just way of governing the European continent. And I think until the Russians come to this determination, we're going to have a problem.
And election security?
Sure. With the caveat that I am not an election security expert, I think one, as a point of fact, my understanding is that the Senate, under Mitch McConnell's leadership, did in fact appropriate additional funds recently for additional election security, which I for one applaud. I think there are clearly some common sense steps that need to be taken in order to make sure that when we as American citizens go to the polls, we can have confidence that the will of the people is reflected in the outcome of the election. It starts with, among other things, having a paper trail, a literal paper record of our ballots, which we know in many states at this point doesn't exist. And so I think it's important to see this additional funding flowing from the federal government to state governments. In terms of the interplay between voter IDs and fraud, putting aside potentially external actors hoping to sway the outcome of US elections, my understanding is that there's been little to no empirical evidence of widespread voter fraud, and that measures to require IDs aren't necessarily useful in terms of solving that problem. If we're really looking to maximize the extent to which Americans can go to the polls and have their decisions reflected in our elected leaders, what we need to be thinking about are along the lines of making Election Day a national holiday so that people don't have to worry about taking their kids to school, going to work, and whether they'll have enough time to make it to the ballot box, expanding early voting, and measures along those lines.
I'll just add, I think all those measures are important, and voting should be made easier to vote. I will just add that I've monitored elections in some pretty poor countries that are not exactly exemplars of sort of democratic health. I was just in Moldova a couple months ago monitoring an election, post-Soviet countries. Moldova requires every citizen to have 2 forms of ID to vote. You need your national ID, and then you need a special ID that's required to vote on voting day. So if these countries that are the recipients of massive American aid money and that are sort of, they'd probably get a 2 on the Freedom House scale of how democratic they are. And I've monitored elections in Ukraine, in Georgia, all former Soviet countries. If these are all countries that you need an ID to vote, and by the way, every European country, every solid European democracy requires an ID to vote. If all these countries require IDs to vote, I don't see why we can't do it in this country. I don't see why that's not possible, while simultaneously making voting a national holiday and making it easier for people to register. I think both are perfectly reasonable measures to include.
Okay. Some more questions.
I was wondering why populism in particular seems to have a large correlation with toxic communication between the citizenry and the government. And since previous populist parties in America have not needed to run with such heavy toxic communication, I was wondering why you think that this is a correlation with our current populist leaders. Is it just because of Russian interference, or are there other factors that can be considered?
Okay, and another question?
So earlier you guys were talking about the 2016 election and how it wasn't just President Trump who was affected by the Russian interference. You guys said the other candidates were affected by it. So could you talk about those other candidates other than Bernie who were affected by it?
Okay, and one more question.
Okay. It was stated earlier that in the 2016 election that Russian involvement should be considered more as a conspiracy. My question and concern is, as an oncoming voter in the 2020 election, what should I be doing to make sure that the Russian involvement doesn't just become a conspiracy?
Okay. Okay, we have three questions, one dealing with populism and toxic rhetoric, and then two other questions that deal with Russia and voting, one pertaining to Russia's impact on other candidates, and then the other pertaining to what can you do as a citizen.
I think toxicity is pretty much intrinsic to populism, because the whole logic of populism, whether it's on the right or left, is there's the community of the good, and they are innocent and pure, whether that's white people or ethnic Hungarians or the workers. In the case of Bernie, like the 99%, right? That's the community of the good and the pure, and then we have the community of the bad and the evil, and that could be non-white people, it could be non-ethnic Hungarians, or it could be the 1%. And I think any sort of simplistic political rhetoric that tries to look at the world in such a way is going to easily resort to toxic language and rhetoric. Regarding the Russian intentions and the candidates that they supported, the other candidate that you could see receiving a lot of support in the 2016 race was Jill Stein of the Green Party, because the goal in the 2016 election was to damage Hillary Clinton, and that meant not just supporting her opponent, Donald Trump, it also meant decreasing turnout among people who would vote for Hillary Clinton. So obviously they wanted to promote Jill Stein because she was going to take voters from the left, but you also saw the Russians devoting a lot of energy to African American voters, because African American voters are an important segment of the Democratic voting base, and so they tried to basically decrease support for Clinton among African American voters by bringing up issues that her husband had supported as president, the criminal justice issues and whatnot. That was another tactic that the Russians were using. And I think in 2020, if you look at what various Russian disinformation outlets, narratives, we see Tulsi Gabbard in the Democratic Party getting a lot of support from Russian outlets. I think it's pretty clear she basically supports Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who's a Russian ally. So that's pretty obvious on that point. Tulsi Gabbard, her foreign policy views are frankly, they're rather isolationist. And she represents this sort of sweet spot where the far right and the far left converge. But I also wouldn't count out, depending on who the Democrats nominate in 2020, I don't think it's going to be as clear cut as it was in 2016 in terms of who the Russians are backing, if you will. I mean, I don't really want to speculate necessarily, but I will. I mean, in 2016, it was pretty clear, right? You had Hillary Clinton, who Putin had personal reasons for not liking her. He directly accused her of supporting demonstrations against her and against him in 2012. When he returned to power, there were massive street protests in Moscow, and he directly accused her of fomenting them as Secretary of State. She was also sort of a pretty traditional Democratic foreign policy hawk. She supported NATO enlargement. She supported America's traditional alliance structures. Whereas, here is this guy, Donald Trump, who was saying NATO was obsolete, We're not going to defend our NATO allies if they don't pay enough. We're not going to support our allies in Asia and Japan and South Korea. He was a real disruptive force. I also think, he made America, look like an untrustworthy leader on the global stage. And we can argue, whether or not the Russian bet paid off. But I think from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that was why he supported Trump over Clinton. I'm looking at the Democratic race right now, and it looks like Elizabeth Warren's probably going to be the nominee. Elizabeth Warren probably supports pretty big defense cuts. She came out in, I think, the second debate in favor of a nuclear non-first use policy, which is a really kind of, out there left-wing thing that people supported in the 80s, which was basically to declare that the US would never be the first power to use a nuclear weapon. It's not a real serious policy proposal, but it's something that, if you were the Russians, you would want the United States to declare that openly, right? To say, to have no ambiguity about whether or not you would use a nuclear weapon first. I just think it's just going to be a much more confusing picture in 2020 if the Democrats nominate Elizabeth Warren. And I think a lot of people are prepared to think, again, that this is a partisan issue, that the Russians are going to back the Republicans and Donald Trump no matter what, and they're in cahoots with the Republican Party. And I don't think that that's necessarily something that we should take for granted. I think there are a lot of other factors in play.
Just a couple of things to add to that. The Senate report that came out last week that I mentioned in my opening statement had information that I had never seen before that showed that the Russian online trolls in the Republican primary had actually worked to the disadvantage of other Republican nominees, including Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. So again, as James is getting at in one sense, Putin had particular interests in terms of promoting candidates that he felt were going to work to the advantage of Russia, and that doesn't necessarily map well onto the US political spectrum in terms of only Republicans or only Democrats. The other thing I'll mention is in response to the young woman who asked, what can I do in 2020 to combat Russian involvement in the election? My answer, and before I get to my answer, I'll say the way in which non-democratic leaders are learning from one another means that in all likelihood, it's not just going to be the Russians that are hoping to influence the 2020 election in one way or another. We're going to see the Chinese government, the Iranian government, the Saudi government, and others likely trying to pull from the same playbook. But my message is, you don't need to worry about that, honestly. What you need to worry about are being an educated consumer of the information that's going to come to all of us in the course of the election. And as James was getting at earlier, thinking critically about not just what you're reading, but where it's coming from, thinking about whether it's coming from a legitimate news source. And when you see your friends or your friends' parents putting forward inflammatory information, having real conversations in real life with those people and saying, do you actually believe this? Let's talk about what this is, who is behind this sort of information, what are the local issues that matter to us on which we want to base our vote? If everybody in the United States did that, we would not have any problem with Russia or any other government interfering in our elections.
We were beginning to run out of time, so I'll take two more questions.
So I wanted to ask, what do you see the long-term future of Russia being? Like, what do you think will happen in Russia after Putin either leaves power or however that happens? I mean, do you think Russia can ever become a democracy, basically?
Okay, and one more.
My question is specifically directed towards Mr. Churchill, I think that's how you pronounce it. Concerning the situation of queer people in Russia, what would you, as a member of the press, recommend someone do to ensure they're updated on the situation, and how would someone express their interest to the news? What could someone like me do to ensure the voices of the oppressed queer people in Russia are actually heard?
Well, these are really connected questions. And I hate to be pessimistic, but we have a long history that we can look at with Russia. And there was maybe a period of 5 or 6 years when it was when it was vaguely democratic. Otherwise, it's just been one form of tyranny or another, whether it was czars or communists or now Vladimir Putin. And I'm not saying this to be fatalistic and to say that Russians as a people are incapable of democracy or condemned to live under tyranny forever. I don't think that's true. I think that there are people who are fighting for democracy and freedom in that country, but I think we just need to be very realistic about the near-term chances for that. I don't see a near-term scenario where Russia becomes a democracy that respects its neighbors. So I think in terms of policymakers in the United States, what we need to do is contain Russia, contain it as a military force, and that means supporting NATO and supporting our allies in Europe. And it also means containing Russia now in this new sphere, this hybrid war sphere, this cyber sphere, to protect our own democracies and societies from being corrupted by Russian money, which is a new threat that we didn't have during the Cold War. There weren't these, oligarchs investing billions of dollars in shady shell companies in London. There weren't, obviously there was Russian support for political subversion in the West, but it was pretty clear who they were supporting. It was, local communist parties or kind of, far left fellow travelers in the United States. It wasn't, there was a lot of hysteria around communism in this country domestically in the 1950s, but there was never really a threat that the Communist Party was going to take over the United States. I think now it's a much more insidious threat that we're facing. Because again, it's not really this clear ideological opponent that we had during the Cold War. And in regards to the issue of LGBT people in Russia, it's obviously very concerning, particularly in Chechnya, where they're being murdered in large numbers by a Islamist government with the full support of the Putin regime. And I think the most we can do is highlight these stories, make sure that they are publicized, that the perpetrators are held responsible and sanctioned, and that those who are able to flee and escape are given sanction in Western societies, sanctuary in Western societies.
I'll add to that by not necessarily addressing the future of Russia, which I certainly don't purport to know. I will say I wanted to go back to my answer with respect to the state of the State Department. And note that as we look to this uncertain future, both with respect to the challenge from a rising China and from Russia, and populist parties for that matter, what we really need to be investing in are the diplomatic tools that will allow us to engage in the world and stand up for American values. So one thing that I think sheds some amount of, or provides some amount of optimism in the midst of what we're struggling with right now is, as the White House has turned to its annual budget and tried to eviscerate diplomacy and development support each year on a bipartisan basis, members of Congress have pushed back and said, no, these are important capabilities for the U.S. What I hope in the years to come, as we continue to confront these challenges, is that we invest in diplomacy and support for civic organizations, for independent journalists abroad, as a strategic matter, not just as something that's good to do, but as something that is necessary to do given the world environment in which that we're facing at the moment.
Let me close this panel by telling a story of an event that happened to Putin not long ago. He was sleeping and woke up in the middle of the night, and there was Stalin's ghost. He said, "Comrade Stalin, what are you doing here?" And the ghost said, "Vladimir, I understand you have some problems." And Putin said, "Yes, I've got problems. I've got a growing China on one border. I've got the Americans, they're always a problem. The Europeans, I've got problems domestic protesters. I've got, what should I do? What would you do? And Stalin's ghost said, you know, I had problems in my day, so I can give you 2 recommendations. My first recommendation is paint the Kremlin blue. My second recommendation is liquidate all your opponents. And Putin looked at the ghost of Stalin and said, why should I paint the Kremlin blue? And the ghost said, I knew you wouldn't ask about the second thing. Thank you very much.
So thank you to all our speakers this morning. For those of you who are registered for the luncheon, it's in the Hatch Ballroom down the hall. If you're not registered, the speaker will be broadcast live here at 1 p.m. if you want to come in here. And we'll see you all at Ambassador McFall's keynote this evening.